of the most powerful men on earth, holds a position that has existed for nearly 2,000 years. As the world changes and faith evolves, his authority remains. What began with one apostle has become 1.2 billion followers under one man. He is the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope. And this is his path to power. In this episode, what happens when the Pope threatens a 2,000-year-old tradition, leaving two men at the helm of one divine office for the first time in over 500 years?
We're following breaking news this morning. Pope Benedict XVI has announced he is resigning.
For the first time in 600 years, a pope is retiring.
I was astonished when Benedict resigned. It came completely out of the blue.
Benedict's resignation was an amazing thing.
In the last 2,000 years, only 4 other popes have resigned.
Plena libertate declaro, me ministerio episcopi Romae, successor Sancti Peti, vi bonos cardinali.
It was wonderfully comically announced. He announced it at a papal audience in Latin, and you had to see all around the room anyone who understood what he was saying. It was an astonishing thing to do.
It raises so many questions. What happens now?
2 weeks after Benedict XVI's resignation, Pope Francis is elected, and the papal crown is handed from one man to the other.
We have 2 popes, but only one is the pope. The problem with having 2 popes is that you have to decide, who do you listen to?
Benedict was 85 when he resigned. He inherited the financial mess. He inherited the mess of sexual abuse. He inherited the administrative chaos. Benedict resigned because he realized that these problems were simply too great for him.
It's not like other human institutions. It's created, we believe, by God. And this man is resigning from all of that. That's not what Pope's supposed to do.
For 2,000 years, the legacy of St. Peter has been a divine office passed down from one pope to the next. But can 2 men hold a legitimate claim to one godly office?
It's left us with this situation of a pope and an extra pope. And that's always going to change the nature of an institution. Who's the real pope?
In 2013, millions of people watch as Benedict XVI peacefully hands the papacy over to Pope Francis. But in the past, 2 living men with claim to one legacy has resulted in nothing but chaos.
In the 10th and 11th centuries, if you've got 2 popes, you've got 2 factions. It's an extraordinary episode.
Benedict IX was a teenager. He was the most eligible member of the powerful Roman family that ruled the city of Rome. They wanted him to be pope for their own financial gain, their own territorial supremacy.
The papacy was the legal center of the Western world. If a king needed a dispensation to marry his brother's wife, If people wanted to take possession of a local parish, they would have to get permission and pay a fee at Rome. You are enormously powerful, immense responsibility.
But 19-year-old Benedict has no interest in bureaucracy or public service. He is only interested in the privileges of power.
Benedict is someone who was clearly made pope in order to enrich his family. On the secular side, not someone who had any sort of a spiritual authority, even spiritual training.
Nepotism tended to produce a group of wealthy parasites who lived like grandees, who were also clergy.
He was incompetent. He was morally compromised in many ways.
Benedict was up to his neck in robbery and murder. He was using his position to gain wealth at the expense of the people of Rome.
By the year 1044, the cardinals are fed up. They decide the church needs a real spiritual and political leader. Something must be done.
The holiest priest in Rome came to him and said, "You need to step down for the good of the church. What can I give you?" And made him some sort of offering.
Benedict IX sold the papacy,
which of course is against the canons.
In the 11th century, conclaves had not yet been invented. Popes are often chosen by brute force or nepotism.
Buying church power was considered one of the worst sins there was. So the fact that he had actually sold the papacy in return for money was appalling to everyone.
For the first time in recorded history, a pope resigns in exchange for money, which catapults the papacy into the world of dirty politics.
The papacy becomes a pawn in the politics of central Italy.
But though the young pope accepts the cardinal's bribe, this will not be the last the world hears of Benedict IX. In 1044, after 8 years of desecrating the papacy, young Pope Benedict IX accepts the cardinal's bribe to resign.
They ganged up together and drove Benedict out of the city. The Roman people picked a new pope, and he took the name Sylvester III.
Just weeks after handing the papacy over to Sylvester, the former Pope Benedict IX and his family decide they want the throne back.
And the awkward thing now is that there were two popes, and both of them were claiming to be the heir of St. Peter. Benedict, however, had a wealthier family than Sylvester, and so his family rallied behind him, gave him an army, he marched back into Rome, and he drove Sylvester III out.
you find yourself bewildered by this, and it's so far from the apostles or how any Christian leader should be. But that was the way the church was. It's about spiritual power uncomfortably mixed with worldly power.
Six months after accepting the cardinal's bribe to resign, Benedict IX is reinstated as Pope.
Now their positions had reversed. Benedict is in Rome, and Sylvester III is in exile, but they're both still claiming to be Pope.
Benedict IX was the first pope that comes back, and they have to decide, well, who's the real pope now?
With Rome's allegiances split between Benedict and Sylvester, the Church faces a crisis of faith. How does one decide who holds the legacy of St. Peter? The Romans will not have long to figure it out. Only 1 month into Benedict IX's second papacy, he complicates the matter even further.
Benedict, then, in the way of impetuous young men. He decided he didn't want to be Pope anymore. He had had enough. He wanted to get married. He handed the papacy over to his godfather, and he became Pope Gregory VI. Then the really scandalous thing happened. Benedict's ladylove decided not to marry him after all, and he decided he wanted the papacy back. Gregory VI said, no, I'm Pope. Sylvester III, who's still in the village outside Rome, said, don't forget about me. So now we actually have 3 popes. We have 3 popes, and there is no one to declare which one is the most legitimate.
Benedict's, Sylvester's, and Gregory's factions all fight in the streets of Rome over who is the rightful heir to the papal throne. And in the end, Benedict IX's wealthy family wins again.
Benedict was Pope 3 times in the end.
After Benedict's reign sends the church into a tailspin, the spiritual foundation of the papacy has been shattered.
All of this becomes a real problem for the church, and you've got to sort that out.
In July of 1048, Benedict IX is officially ousted once and for all. The cardinals decide the fairest way to consolidate papal power is to ignore Sylvester and Gregory's claims to the throne, clear the decks, and elect a new pope.
One of the problems in the 11th century was that there was no clear way of choosing a pope. It was a matter of frequently murder, bribery, and also relationship. The sons of popes sometimes became popes. Choosing a pope, it's very confused, and it's never a pretty sight.
It's very clear that the office of the papacy can belong to whoever has the most military might to enforce it.
The cardinals realize they must solidify rules for papal elections. They convene in an effort to solve this problem once and for all. And the result becomes one of the most iconic symbols of the papacy.
In the 12th century, cardinals who were senior clergy in Rome made what they called a college. And after that, cardinals would choose a pope in public. So that sort of regularized things, but of course you can always twist elections.
After nearly 200 years of corrupt public elections, what is known today as the conclave is designed. The word conclave, a Latin term meaning with a key, signifies that the cardinals are locked in to avoid the interference of outside politics. As of 1274, papal elections are held in secret.
That cardinals would be cut off from the world, enclosed, make their votes, vote again. There would be that famous white smoke at the end.
For the last 700 years, papal elections have been held the same way. Cardinals are locked in the Vatican and vote again and again until a 2/3 majority is achieved.
And each round of balloting is burned so that nobody can see who voted for whom. That's what generates the smoke.
In the Middle Ages, cardinals added a damp straw to the burning ballots to create the black smoke, signifying that no pope has been chosen. The white smoke that hails a new pope was made by burning the paper alone. Today, chemical compounds are added to the ballots to color the smoke. Modern conclaves usually only last for a few days. But in the 13th century, they could go on for months.
In the 13th century, bribery would be involved, the rivalries of kings. People were basically stonewalling, filibustering.
In 1292, the cardinals assembled to elect a new pope. But warring factions cannot reach the two-thirds majority, and the conclave goes on for a full 2 years.
Without the Pope, Rome was a mess. Marauders and robber gangs wanted to dominate the city, and to a great extent did. Without the Pope functioning as a sort of local king.
With Rome in shambles and no end to the conclave in sight, it looks as if the resignation of one teenage pope may have unraveled St. Peter's legacy for good. In 1294, the cardinals are determined to renew the spiritual supremacy of the papacy by electing a pope through the proper channels. Warring factions are deadlocked, which has left Rome without a leader and in dire shape. Frustrated by the delay and state of Rome, a hermit monk named Pietro Angelario writes to the conclave.
He was an example of these kinds of crazy guys who live up a mountain and live on beans and read nothing but the gospel.
Angelario warns the cardinals that vengeance will fall on them if they continue the stalemate. Taking his letter as a divine sign, the cardinals decide to elect him Pope.
In the 13th century, you had a great succession of reforming popes. Politicians thought that this is not how a pope should be. So what they did was elect a pope who was as unworldly as you could possibly hope for, a hermit. They called him Celestine, the heavenly one.
Celestine V does not want to be pope. He'd rather be praying off alone by himself, and he goes to do this papacy rather reluctantly.
It's not super clear that he even exactly knew what was going on. It's not clear how sharp mentally he was.
Celestine V was just hopeless. He couldn't run the church at all.
After only 5 months in office, Celestine V announces his retirement.
And during that 5 months, the French crown manipulated him to get all sorts of concessions and control over more power. And the Roman contingent in the College of Cardinals became increasingly alarmed. He was helped to retire by his successor, who was a pro-Roman Pope, Boniface VIII. It was said that he whispered through a hole in the Pope's cell where he prayed, and that he said he was the voice of God and told the Pope to resign so that he could be elected Pope in his stead.
He'd made a vow to become a monk, simply living in retirement for the good of his health. The only Pope who ever voluntarily did before Benedict XVI.
A couple of years before Pope Benedict XVI resigns, Pope Benedict took a trip and he laid his pallium on the grave of Celestine V. People didn't know it at the time, but that might have been a signal, because a year and a half later, he too would resign his papacy.
But despite the peaceful nature in which Celestine V resigned, and because of the violence and instability surrounding the resignation of Benedict IX 250 years earlier, the new pope must make sure that Celestine is never heard from again.
After Celestine retired and Boniface became the Pope, he felt that it was dangerous to have 2 living popes.
You can't have another pope knocking about and threatening the Pope.
Immediately after Celestine leaves the Vatican, Boniface has him attacked and locked up.
He didn't want Celestine talking to anybody. He didn't want him to be able to communicate with his supporters, so essentially put him under house arrest in order to protect his own legitimacy as Pope.
And so Celestine dies in captivity.
the 13th century, however, a retired pope is not the only threat to a sitting pope's power. In a time when the lines between church and state are fluid, kings are just as threatening to papal power as previous popes.
There was always a bit of problem as to who was in charge. Was it the king or was it the pope?
So much of the maneuvering and back and forthing and jousting that goes on with the papacy has to do with the fact that it was in Italy. Italy is not a country yet. Italy is basically up for grabs. The Normans grab part of it, the Franks grab part of it, the Germans grab part of it. Italy is always contested. So if you're going to control any major part of Italy, you have to get the Pope on your side.
You want to raise an army, you need the Pope's blessing.
Because of the volatile nature of medieval European politics, the papacy becomes dependent on the surrounding monarchies for stability and vice versa.
The Pope didn't have an army. He didn't have anything other than moral persuasion on his side. And so what we see the early popes doing are making these alliances with different secular leaders.
At the end of the 13th century, the most powerful monarch in Europe is King Philip IV of France. He had manipulated Pope Celestine into siphoning him church money and land. But after Celestine's resignation, the new Pope, Boniface VIII, is not so easily manipulated.
When Boniface VIII became Pope, he saw the French influence as something that had gone way, way out of bounds. And so he positioned himself essentially as the anti-France Pope. So Philip IV and Boniface had these very real clash of powers. Boniface began to generate some very, very harsh language about the power of the papacy. Here's a letter that he wrote to Philip IV of France. He said, "Listen, son," literally, that's how he begins it. "Son, God has set us over kings and kingdoms. Let no one persuade you that you have superiority." So it is this very explicit language that says the Pope has control over the king.
But King Philip has an agenda, and he does not intend to let one insubordinate pope stand in his way. After the resignation of his puppet pope Celestine V in 1294, King Philip IV of France is determined to reassert his power over the papacy. But the new Pope, Boniface VIII, refuses to give in to the greedy monarch.
Philip IV comes to the throne at a time in which warfare is fought by purchasing armies. And he, like other monarchs, needs more and more money.
And the church is very wealthy.
So when Boniface dies, King Philip ensures that a pope who will give him what he wants is elected.
He expressed very clearly to the College of Cardinals that he preferred this particular French candidate. It wasn't an easy election. But ultimately, the French side was strong enough to win.
A French prelate who takes the name Clement V becomes the Pope. Philip actually asks them to come to France to crown him Pope.
The popes, of course, had been appointed in Rome from the time of St. Peter.
King Philip of France has a very powerful hold on Pope Clement V. This is a weak man, and he's intimidated by Philip.
Clement's just notorious. He just did whatever he was asked. Clement V actually promised Philip a flat-out portion of the church tithe. It just went straight into the royal coffers. He also signed off on the expulsion of Jews as a danger to the church, in knowledge that the wealth was going to go to Philip. That's very blatant.
By 1309, King Philip has turned Pope Clement V into a pawn of the French crown, And in an attempt to solidify his power over the church, the French king lays the groundwork for what will be the papacy's most notorious resignation by undermining its very foundation.
Peter is buried on the Vatican Hill, and St. Peter's Basilica is built over his tomb. Popes are seen as inheriting that charisma and that role, standing in for the apostle. His tomb is the foundation charter for the papacy.
But King Philip demands that Pope Clement leave the legacy of St. Peter in Rome and move the papacy to operate under his thumb in France.
The Pope eventually will end up setting up quarters at Avignon.
Rather than being in a landscape where the Pope could actually act as an independent power and make alliances with anyone that he chose, he was now firmly entrenched in one country, clearly under the control of one king. That was what warped the papacy. It's a little bit as though Washington, D.C. suddenly upped and said, well, now Manhattan is going to be the capital of the entire United States.
For the first time since the invention of the conclave, the one with true power over the church is not the one chosen by God, but a power-hungry monarch instead.
It's a dream of all the great rulers of medieval Europe to control the papacy. Philip actually got the papacy into France. Once you've done that, the Pope can become a puppet of what you want to get done.
That is a moment for the church that becomes very troubling. You're abdicating the seat of where the church is supposed to lie. If you leave the bones of Peter behind and you're not moving them, you're moving to this other place. What you're saying is that maybe this isn't as important to the church as we have thought it was previously. And that becomes a really dangerous situation for holding together not just the papacy, but holding together beliefs and tenets of the church.
Leaving Rome costs the papacy its religious authority throughout Europe. But once the church becomes established in France, Pope Clement V finds that, despite being hundreds of miles from the bones of St. Peter, there are certain benefits to the new location.
It was very clearly a time when they had given up their spiritual authority in order to enjoy material prosperity. The College of Cardinals, which also became centered at Avignon after this, was absolutely notorious for luxurious living and for having banquets that went on for days and for spending church money in order to take care of themselves.
But the Avignon papacy worked. It's in southern France. It's much more central to Europe than the Italian peninsula. It was efficient. It had a decent bureaucracy. There's actually a good case for the Avignon papacy. Big problem though, it doesn't have the tomb of Peter. And what's the point of a pope who doesn't sit at the tomb of Peter?
Despite being miles from the spiritual foundation of the papacy, Pope Clement V remains in France and continues to lead the church under King Philip until they both die in 1314. His successor continues his papacy in Avignon, as does the Pope after him.
The papacy was more or less captured by the King of France. For a long period of time, it was completely the instrument of the French crown, and almost every cardinal who was appointed to the College of Cardinals during this time was French.
By 1347, it appears that the papacy has become an arm of the French crown for good. In the mid-1360s, the papacy has left Rome and been operating in Avignon, France for almost 60 years. At this point, the cardinals are almost all French and have become accustomed to the luxurious lifestyle afforded to them as a thank you for the church's loyalty to the French crown. But outside the walls of the lush papal castle, The rest of Europe is a wasteland, setting the stage for what will be the last papal resignation for 600 years.
The Black Death, this contagious, dreadful disease, devastated Europe.
Pretty much the entire population was wiped out.
In the wake of the plague, the papacy is forced to reevaluate its role in Europe and face dire conditions in the city it abandoned.
With the absence of the papacy from Rome, the upkeep of the city began to fail. A great deal of the upkeep of Rome came out of the Pope's coffers. Now this was all going to France. Law and order became very, very shaky. You have a rise in pickpockets and muggings because there's no king in Rome, there's no emperor in Rome, and now there's no pope in Rome.
The Romans learned somewhat reluctantly that the city depended on the presence of the papacy to flourish, to become anything more than just a bit of a wreck.
Fed up with the sheltered confines of Avignon, Pope Urban V decides that the papacy has lost sight of its spiritual purpose and must return to the bones of St. Peter in Rome.
Urban V, a reform-minded pope, is appalled by the luxury. He was appalled by the self-indulgence. In Avignon, he announced to the cardinals that they could only have one course at dinner rather than their usual 10-course banquet. And it had increasingly become clear that as long as the papacy was tied to the fortunes of any country, that the ability to act as a spiritual leader would be seriously compromised. He was convicted that the papacy needed to return to its home in Rome. But it was not an easy transition.
The cardinals, who had become used to their indulgent lifestyle in Avignon, did not appreciate the rundown conditions in the fallen city. But Pope Urban V and his successor, another Frenchman, Gregory XI, remained firm in their spiritual conviction that the papacy belongs at the tomb of St. Peter.
There is a lot of resentment about their having to sort of come down in the world, which I think just shows what a cushioned, isolated existence they were living in Avignon. That you have a Europe that's been devastated by the plague, that the entire social structure of Europe has changed, that in some places 90% of the population has died. But the primary concern of the College of Cardinals is that they're not getting enough courses for dinner. So you definitely have a sense in which during the Avignon papacy, it has gotten so out of touch with what the church is supposed to be doing.
When Pope Gregory XI dies in 1378, many of the cardinals prepare to move back to Avignon. But the frustrated Romans call for a sign that the papacy has freed itself from the French crown and will return to the principles of the church they once knew.
The Roman population, who were always very volatile and who regularly intervened in papal elections, after a long string of French popes, were determined to have an Italian pope.
The conclave of 1378 is met with angry mobs of Romans chanting outside the Vatican, demanding a renewed papal investment in their beloved city. And though the cardinals miss their extravagant French lifestyle, they worry what might happen if the Romans' demands are not met.
And so an Italian pope. Urban VI was elected. But he seems to have been unhinged by becoming the pope. Instantly reveals himself to be a megalomaniac, locking up people who didn't agree with him. So instead of being a unifying figure, he becomes a symbol of division.
Half of the cardinals stand behind the maniacal Pope Urban VI in Rome, while the other half panic and flee back to Avignon, where they elect another pope, Clement VII. The once universal church is now split. Catholics are torn between two different popes, running two functioning church bureaucracies from two different places.
There was an election of a pope, and some people didn't like that election. So some people say, we're going to set up a church someplace else. And so this becomes a very big battle.
So in solving one problem, getting the Pope back to Rome, you've created a much worse one.
We went through a long period when there were always at least two different people claiming to be Pope.
This unprecedented break in the Church is what Catholics refer to as the Western Schism.
You've got popes saying, I'm Pope, and some popes are classed as anti-popes because other people don't recognize them. But who is the anti-pope? Who's the real Pope?
For nearly 40 years, the Church is divided. And Catholics are forced to choose the true heir to St. Peter's legacy.
Where is the place that we are centered? That needs to flow from the Pope. What do you do if you have two popes? Then it becomes a real problem for the Church, and you've got to sort that out.
This schism made a mockery of the whole idea of the Pope and the Vicar of Christ being the successor of Peter.
If there is one St. Peter, he can only have one legacy, held by only one man. Two popes become a clear sign that the spiritual source of papal power has been abandoned.
Having two popes is impossible. It's shattering for Christendom. Reformers say, we've got to do something about this.
With the future of the Church hanging in the balance, in 1415, cardinals on both sides look for a solution.
They convene a general council at Constance, and the popes involved are summoned and either deposed or invited to resign.
Both the Roman Pope, Gregory XII, and the Avignon Pope, Benedict XII, are forced to resign. In 1415, Pope Gregory XII will be the last pope to leave the office alive, until 2013, when Pope Benedict XVI makes a shocking announcement.
The last time a pope resigned happened just about 600 years ago. That would be Pope Gregory XII back in 1415.
Throughout the history of the Catholic Church, only 4 popes have ever resigned. And Pope Benedict XVI is the only one who has ever done it peacefully and of his own volition. But what does it mean to have 2 living popes? How can 2 men hold one legacy of St. Peter?
Everyone was surprised. Catholics were surprised, non-Catholics were surprised. It was a strong contrast to John Paul II, who insisted on remaining Pope until his dying gasp.
In 2005, after reigning for 27 years, Pope John Paul II passed away after a long and public battle with Parkinson's disease.
In a way, the act of resignation was a devastating comment on the last 5 or 6 years of his predecessor. A flight in the face of the whole theology of the papacy as it had evolved in modern times. The notion that John Paul had propagated, that the papacy was a cross which was laid on your shoulders and you could not shake it off. Benedict said, well, it's a job, and if you can't do it, you should let somebody else try.
By resigning in the face of old age, Pope Benedict XVI has made a clear statement about the divinity of the papal office.
I think that was a reminder to everybody in any position of authority or power. It's not just about me. It's actually about, am I being effective? Am I really serving the community and serving the Church properly?
What Benedict did in resigning was to make it easier for successive popes to be able to say, I'm 80 years old, I'm not going to stay until I fall down dead in this office. That's thinking more like a CEO than anything else.
Alighting from the helicopter, Francis thanks the pilots, then, seeing his predecessor, goes toward him to embrace him. This is a historic moment.
There's not any kind of precedent. Benedict's resignation, who really did do it voluntarily and off his own bat.
Today, Pope Benedict XVI lives in a quiet apartment in the Vatican. He has passed the Holy Office peacefully down to Pope Francis, leaving the power struggles of the past behind.
The biggest gift that ever happened to the papacy is Pope Benedict XVI resigning, because he allowed the papacy not to become a trap.
In terms of looking to the future, as any pope begins to get older or begins to have any difficulties, the question of resignation will be on the horizon.
Francis has also talked about resigning, and you don't know how serious he is. He's a mischievous man, and he's got an agenda, and he's an old man, and I think he'll want to see that agenda out first. But it may be that he has learnt the lesson of watching John Paul II collapse into helplessness. It would be very interesting if Pope now said, right, I've done my bit, someone else can have a go.
In announcing his voluntary retirement, Pope Benedict has shaken the foundation of the papacy. If Pope Francis retires as well, one of the most powerful men on earth holds a position that has existed for nearly 2,000 years. As the world changes and faith evolves, his authority remains. What began with one apostle has become 1.2 billion followers under one man. He is the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope. And this is his path to power. In this episode, never before seen orders sent from Rome to the New World expose the most scandalous popes in Vatican history and reveal how spectacular advancements in art, science, and exploration are embroiled in webs of sex, bribery, and murderous rivalries. From the time of St. Peter through the Middle Ages, popes act as beacons of faith, morality, and religious leadership. But as church influence expands, the trappings of power will seduce even the godliest of men. In 1417, the papacy has been split between France and Italy for 40 years. But after the devastation of the plague, Pope Martin V reunites the Church and begins to rebuild the once great institution in the once thriving city of Rome.
It was with the return of the papacy to Rome that its heart began to beat again, and it started to grow and to function as the center of the Western Church. And that was when the Renaissance really kicked in.
Very gradually, as Europe climbs back into economic activity, you start to see a class emerge with enough money to have aspirations to buy things. Luxury comes back on the scene.
As a merchant class begins to rise, Europe ushers in an era of revolutionary advancements in art and science. explorers set out in search of new lands. The first mechanical clock and the Gutenberg printing press are invented.
And on the walls of the churches, you start to see for the first time that when human beings appear, they're not just tiny. Man is standing a little closer next to God.
And the man closest to God is the Pope.
We owe some of the most significant art in Western history to the popes of the Renaissance.
It's the world of Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, and a whole succession of popes act as patrons to this huge flowering of the Western imagination.
The Renaissance popes reshaped the city of Rome into what we know it today.
Today, upwards of 10 million tourists a year visit Rome to see the art and architecture commissioned by Renaissance popes. The Sistine Chapel, Capitoline Museums, and the cloister of Santa Maria della Pace, all built in the name of the Church during this time in European history. But the celebrated advancements in art and exploration come at a hefty price.
For all of the beauty and creativity that we think of now as the Renaissance, a lot of that work was financed by corruption. You want the Sistine Chapel? The Sistine Chapel was paid for by bribery. A lot of that beauty, the flip side of it was brutality.
The church is very human, made up of sinful people who are striving to live a life according to the Spirit, and yet we fall. And big men with big titles fall.
We always have to remember that this history of the papacy is not always a good history.
Behind the iconic images of the 15th and 16th centuries lie webs of scandal, violence, and depravity surrounding the popes of that time.
The thing you have to really remember about this moment in history is there is no other game in town but Catholicism. The higher up you get in this organization, which is a kind of multinational by this time, the more important your influence is. And the Pope is the CEO of this global institution.
And Italy at this time was an unbelievably dangerous place to be an important person.
Throughout the Renaissance, the Church amasses an exorbitant amount of wealth through property holdings. Churches act as local banks. They hand out loans, collect tithes, and sit on vast reserves of gold and silver reaped through political alliances. With the Church's swelling wealth comes immense power, and Europeans stop at nothing to gain favor with the Church and garner influence within it.
If you read Shakespeare and you read Jacobean drama and stuff like that, Italy at the time becomes this shorthand for evil and grotesque double-dealing and poisoning.
Italy at this time is of course not a country. She's a set of little city-states, and the basic tool of loyalty in all of these places is family. Family. You know, the mafia doesn't grow out of Italy for no reason at all.
The families that control these city-states are in constant competition with one another for money, land, and most importantly, power.
The most important city-states were Milan, run by the Sforza family, Florence, which came under the domination of the Medici family, and there was Rome, which was the kingdom in which the king was the Pope.
Today, we don't often think of popes as family men, but in the 1400s, it was extremely common for popes to have children.
It's pre the Victorian moment and the Puritan moment. So all of these people who are running this big institution, many of whom have come from top-notch families, cannot get married, and they understand that. But that doesn't appear to mean chaste, because the Pope will have children.
By stacking the College of Cardinals with sons and nephews, popes are able to ensure that their families stay in power.
There is a great problem when the papacy changes between families. Rome can become a very dangerous, even violent place there, where the faction that's controlled the Vatican finds itself under threat.
I think the Pazzi conspiracy is a beautiful microcosm of how crazy a place Renaissance Italy was.
By the 1470s, the Italian families had been embroiled in power struggles for generations, and the newly appointed Pope Sixtus IV, a member of the ambitious Della Rovere family, feels an imminent threat from one of his rivals.
There's conflict with the Medicis.
The Medici family, they were kind of a messy family. I think about them as being the dynasty of the Renaissance.
The Medicis had interfered with some business dealings of the Della Roveres.
One of Pope Sixtus's many nephews is a vicious nutcase. Says the answer to our problems is get rid of the Medici, get rid of this headache.
This was just a stupid idea. I mean, the Medici clan was huge.
The Pope agreed to the murder of Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother.
The Della Roveres recruit members of the Pazzi family, another Italian banking empire.
The second wealthiest family in Florence was the Pazzi, who resented the Medici because they felt that the Medici had unfair advantages.
On Sunday, April 26, 1478, the assailants attacked the Medici brothers at a mass in Florence.
The conspirators attacked and killed the brother and attacked Lorenzo, who escaped.
Lorenzo musters his troops. They quickly capture the main conspirators and the murderers, and they're summarily executed.
And on August 6, 1492, just 3 days after Columbus set sail for the New World, with the wealthiest Italian families entangled in murderous rivalries, and the power to rule all of Europe and the Americas at stake, 23 cardinals embark upon one of the most ruthless conclaves in Vatican history. In August of 1492, 23 cardinals must elect a new pope who will lead more Catholics than the world has ever known.
The cardinals will live in the Sistine Chapel until they finally decide who's pope. So it's a very intense hothouse.
Every powerful Italian family has a seat at the table and a horse in the race.
The two most powerful factions at this conclave, one was led by a cardinal named Ascanio Sforza. Sforza's primary rival was Giuliano della Rovere.
And Giuliano della Rovere, the nephew of Sixtus IV, the vicious pope who called for the violent removal of his rival, has inherited his uncle's blind ambition.
Della Rovere had a very powerful personality.
He's very smart and he's very ruthless.
Determined to swing the conclave in his favor, Giuliano della Rovere begins handing out bribes in exchange for votes.
Although the matter may finally be about God and heaven, this is an earthly institution and it's run by men and it has a power structure attached to it. And whenever in history you introduce power structures, you will find forms of corruption.
But while Della Rovere and Sforza wheel and deal center stage, another candidate begins to form his own campaign behind the scenes.
Rodrigo Borgia was both an insider and a dark horse at the same time.
Rodrigo Borgia is a Spanish cardinal who had steadily risen through the ranks of the church since he was a teenager.
He had been through 5 papacies, the most important, powerful member of the Vatican bureaucracy. But he was a Spaniard. That makes him an outsider.
But despite being an outsider, Borgia is an experienced Vatican politician. On day 4 of the conclave, the Spanish cardinal makes his move.
In the middle of the night, 6 mules loaded with silver leave the Borgia Palace in Rome and trot along the streets to the palace of Ascanio Sforza, cardinal and one of his rivals. And it is absolutely clear that somewhere underneath that, a deal has been done. Rodrigo Borgia bought his way into the papacy.
Borgia's first order of business as Pope Alexander VI is to surround himself with a network of people he trusts. Like many powerful men of the era and today, Borgia places his children in the highest ranks of his council.
He had some of his children marry important princes in other dominions. He made his one son a cardinal and gave him all kinds of church income.
It is a story of nepotism, really. People thought, how could these kind of venal arrivists take over the Vatican City?
Flanked by his children, Pope Alexander VI prepares to build a Borgia dynasty.
The hierarchy of the church is about making sure that the papacy stays powerful. And we have a global multinational company operating. It needs a vast administration.
Pope Alexander VI is the father, almost the creator, of modern diplomacy. He introduced the practice of stationing the prototypical ambassadors at the city-states to live there. And then he started doing that with the major North European capitals.
Each of his ambassadors live amongst the clergy in their various stations and report back to the Vatican. Just weeks into his papacy, Alexander VI has consolidated his power across Europe. And he does not intend to stop there.
The New World is discovered, and Columbus is instructed to write letters to the Pope, the sort of chatty little travelogues about all the things that he's seeing and who the natives are and what they look like and how fascinating they are. He's filling in the Pope in order to soften up the Pope towards the Spanish perspective. And because the Portuguese and the Spanish are spatting about who is going to own what.
This got very ugly and very tense, and it seemed likely to result in war.
They turned to the papacy, to Alexander VI, to adjudicate the international boundary.
It's the Pope who literally draws the line on the map of the ocean.
Everything east of that line belonged to Portugal. And that's how Brazil came to be a Portuguese colony.
On May 12, 1493, Pope Alexander VI issues the Inter Cetera. The First Papal Order grants the majority of the New World to his homeland.
The Spanish have the lion's share, and blow me down, but if the Pope doesn't also get a Spanish bride for his second son.
The Papal Order, which leads to hundreds of years of pillaging and destruction of native lands, is still controversial today. The world will soon learn that all of Borgia's accomplishments come with a price. When Rodrigo Borgia becomes Pope Alexander VI in 1492, he ushers in an era of extreme duality. He brings astonishing advancements in art and technology into the Vatican, alongside a culture of corruption, nepotism, and brutal politicking.
He knew how to terrify people. He knew how to bully people. But he was a very astute politician.
He was like a mafia don, like Marlon Brando in The Godfather. Somebody who enjoyed the trappings of power. Often a very good administrator is somebody who wants to get very rich themselves.
Corruption is twofold. It's financial and sexual.
One of the most salacious stories to come out of the Borgia papacy is the banquet of the chestnuts.
The story is that it was a party at which dozens of prostitutes were invited and everybody got naked and all sorts of things happened, somehow involving chestnuts. And supposedly Pope Alexander was present.
Though the tale of the banquet is met with doubt, the story of the Pope's mistress who took up residency in the Vatican is undisputed.
Giulia Farnese was a beautiful young member of an important Italian family. And when Rodrigo became Pope, among the young men he appointed cardinals. One was Giulia's brother. This was a way of buying the girl. I'll make you a cardinal. You let me have her as my mistress. Rodrigo was 60 at the time. She was 15. She lived in the papal palace with the other young Borgias. He had at least one child with her.
To us, that looks like a bundle of contradictions. How can you be conventionally pious and yet be living this kind of contradiction? It's a kind of Latin distinction between the man and the office. People manage to respect the office while being aware that the people who occupy it were extremely fallible.
The modern mind has some trouble with this. Jesus himself was both God and man. The person is both body and soul. The church is both justice, the law, and mercy, forgiveness of sin.
There was a sense in which sin was automatic. Human beings would sin, and if they didn't sin, they wouldn't need the church to help them get out of it.
And one way the Vatican funds the Pope's sins is with the sale of indulgences. Fees paid to the church in exchange for salvation.
If you know you're going to sin, maybe you could buy ahead of time a pardon.
Despite their moral questionability, indulgences pay for many of the treasures we've come to associate with the modern church.
Borgia exemplifies all the things about the Renaissance papacy that we both deplore and admire. A corrupt papacy, but he's great patron of the arts. He begins to employ the greatest artists and architects of the time.
During Borgia's papal rule, the Castle St. Angelo is restored. A center for the University of Rome is built, and Michelangelo draws plans to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica.
One just has to live with the paradox that these things are the product of sin, but they are not themselves sinful. They're wonderful and the world is better for them.
Borgia commissioned so many works of art in the name of God and his family that the image modern Christianity has come to associate with Jesus Christ is said to be modeled after his oldest son, Cesare. But while Alexander VI continues to collect bribes and adorn the Vatican, an old rival hatches a plan to take him down.
The man who will turn out to be Rodrigo Borgia's real nemesis is Giuliano della Rovere.
He's an angry, aggressive man in contrast to Alexander VI's nature, which by everybody's agreement was immensely charming.
Borgia and Della Rovere's rivalry dates back to when they were both young cardinals. But when Borgia wins the papacy in 1492, Della Rovere becomes obsessed with destroying his enemy.
Not surprisingly, when Della Rovere doesn't get the papal throne, he basically leaves Rome in a sulk.
Della Rovere exiled himself to France and attached himself to the French court and tried to work against Pope Alexander VI.
Determined to take out his rival, Della Rovere convinces King Charles VIII of France to capture Naples and on his way to sack Rome and dethrone the Pope.
2 years after Rodrigo Borgia comes to the throne, this army floods over the Alps into northern Italy and towards Rome. It's a major catastrophe.
As the immense French army on its way to Naples approached Rome, the papal court got ready to flee. Alexander decided at the 11th hour, I'm not going to run away.
Despite having no army himself, in the face of 25,000 French soldiers, Pope Alexander VI is determined to fight for Rome and the Church.
Basically, then the Pope is having to negotiate sort of for his life and for the life of Vatican and papal independence.
He invited Charles to come live with him in the Vatican, and he so charmed him, so won him over, that Charles announced, hey, this is the real thing. I'm not going to depose him.
And then Pope Alexander helps to scoot them out on their way.
In one of the greatest diplomatic moves in world history, the Borgia Pope convinces King Charles of France to leave Rome and the papacy intact.
Della Rovere went nuts over this because Della Rovere lost his chance to displace his enemy.
But soon, Giuliano Della Rovere will prove to be just the first of many threats to the world-changing papacy of Alexander VI. In 1494, the papacy is both flourishing and festering in a sea of corruption. And although the Borgia Pope charms King Charles into sparing Rome, his formidable French fleet continues its march through the rest of the Italian peninsula.
The situation in Italy is getting very dodgy, and into this vacuum kind of enters this passionate fundamentalist called Girolamo Savonarola.
Girolamo Savonarola is a charismatic Italian friar living in Florence. As Vatican culture becomes overtaken with materialism and depravity, Savonarola becomes more and more committed to the word of the gospel and takes vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience.
He's a very good preacher and he understands the Bible inside out. He's part of a church, but he sees its corruption. And so he starts to make an attack on the Vatican.
If you take Borgia and Savonarola, they represent polar opposites within the Christianity of the 15th century.
While the Borgia Pope commissions lavish works of art in the name of God, Savonarola hails these expenditures as the downfall of Christianity.
His take on the Renaissance is basically, this is the beginning of hell on earth. This is the beginning of the end.
Savonarola's apocalyptic sermons draw thousands. He blames the Pope for the French invasions and proclaims that God is punishing Italians for the hedonism displayed by the Church.
When Italy was being invaded by French armies for the first time in decades, it was a moment when the world looked as if it was coming to an end. And Savonarola started preaching this world end message before the crisis really hit. So people thought, well, here's a prophet.
He understands what happens when people get frightened. And what he does is to say, Look at all this art all around the walls. There was a time when all you saw was pictures of our saints and Mary and Jesus. And now, along with them, you've got these people of flesh and blood, and there's quite a lot of flesh being shown too. This is the body. This is not the spirit. We're moving away from the true path, and God is punishing us.
While Pope Alexander VI dismisses the fanatical preacher as a passing phase, Savonarola's following only grows.
He did whip up a lot of support in Florence, aimed at Rome, and he wrote some shocking things about Alexander. He wanted the world to see Alexander as the embodiment of evil. He wanted Alexander to be removed from the papacy. Alexander could have had Savonarola taken into custody, killed. He just laughed it off and never defended himself against it.
But on February the 7th, 1497, Savonarola makes a spectacular display of his rebellion that the Pope cannot ignore.
Savonarola contrives this idea of a bonfire to set fire to things that are not necessary and fripperies and are luxuries.
Famously, Savonarola gathered paintings, beautiful objects, luxurious fabrics, all put on a bonfire as a symbol of the last days.
It becomes known in history as the bonfire of the vanities.
Tens of thousands of Florentines flock to the bonfire of the vanities and burn their worldly possessions.
It's a brilliant stroke. It's intimidating, it's public spectacle, it shows his power, and it's dramatic. It is one of the moments in this moment in history that lives on as emblematic of excess luxury and then excess fundamentalism.
Pope Alexander VI realizes Savonarola is no longer someone to be ignored. He deems the fire a declaration of war against the Vatican. In 1497, after months of ignoring Savonarola's incendiary displays against the Vatican, the bonfire of the vanities forces Pope Alexander VI to strike back.
The Pope told him to stop all this. He said no, and the Pope declared him a heretic.
2 months after the spectacle in Florence, Pope Alexander VI has Savonarola excommunicated.
Excommunication is a very powerful tool, which makes a lot of people nervous about coming to hear Savonarola talk. They may believe in him, but the Pope still runs the show, and this guy is going to hell if he's been excommunicated.
He was destroyed by his defiance of the Pope.
For his transgressions, the Pope's supporters demand the heretic die. On May 23rd, 1498, Girolamo Savonarola is pulled into Florence's central square and burned at the stake.
They let him burn until nothing is left.
In August 1503, after creating a diplomatic empire, commissioning some of the greatest works of art the world has ever known, and reigning over one of the most depraved papacies in Vatican history, the Borgia Pope contracts malaria and suddenly dies.
It's such a dramatic decline. A mosquito bites someone, and the entire 11 years of trying to build a dynasty collapses. It's gone. And within a year, the arch enemy has taken the papacy.
Just 3 months after his death, Rodrigo Borgia's arch-rival, Giuliano della Rovere, becomes Pope Julius II.
Della Rovere was not chosen by a college of cardinals that saw in him a holy man suited to be the leader of the universal church. He took the office which he had hungered for by the force of his ability to intimidate, and almost immediately became a kind of egomaniac.
Pope Julius II, still driven by spite and vengeance, makes it his personal mission to destroy everything his nemesis built, starting with Borgia's son, Cesare.
Pope Alexander definitely did go overboard with nepotism, particularly with respect to this son, Cesare.
Cesare was basically being given the keys of the kingdom. He was given control of the army.
After he becomes Pope, Julius II has Cesare Borgia thrown in prison, stripped of his title, and eventually killed.
Della Rovere devoted himself to blackening the reputation of the whole Borgia family.
The rumor starts that Lucretia Borgia Rodriguez's daughter is a whore who is sleeping with her father and probably sleeping with her brother. There is no evidence inside the Borgia history of incest. That doesn't mean it did not happen, but it's a bit like tabloid journalism. Once the mud has been slung, it sticks.
Pope Julius II continues to slander the Borgia name and proclaims their behavior so disgusting that the part of the Vatican they lived in must be closed off.
Julius II had those Borgia apartments sealed up, so contaminated by these evil presences that nobody should go there. They stayed sealed till the 19th century, and now they're a tourist attraction.
Today, over 5 million people tour the restored Borgia apartments every year, making them one of the most visited attractions in Vatican City. And despite Pope Julius II's avid condemnation of the corrupt Borgia papacy, his lifestyle is even more extravagant.
He actually was the great patron of Michelangelo. He rebuilt the whole of St. Peter's. He commissioned Michelangelo to do a dome.
In 1508, Pope Julius II commissions the most famous work in the modern Vatican, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel.
Della Rovere was driven by personal ambition, grandiosity. He wanted Michelangelo to get finished with the Sistine Chapel so he could get to work on Julius's tomb, which was never finished.
Despite his motivations, art flourishes under the Della Rovere Pope, and the papacy becomes stronger and more powerful than ever.
He's a warrior pope who actually goes into battle leading his own soldiers, wearing silver armor. It is to aggrandize himself to some extent, but it's also part of a vision of a papacy that has to be underpinned by power.
Pope Julius II continues flaunting the power of the papacy until his death in 1513. By then, another powerful Italian family has been patiently plotting to take over the papal throne, and the young banking heir will take Renaissance opulence to levels of excess from which the Church may never recover. The Renaissance popes are known for their extravagance. But one pope pushes papal spending beyond the realm of wild excess. Pope Leo X is a member of the wealthy Medici family and has grown up in a lifestyle of lavish luxury.
Giovanni de' Medici was the second son of Lorenzo de' Medici. He was a pleasure-loving man, loved the arts, theater, music, all that sort of thing.
Leo X and members of the Medici dynasty represent the most glorious aspect of the papacy at the beginning of the 16th century and also its nemesis. They are the initiators of the alliance between the papacy and the arts and the corruption of Western Christianity altogether.
Leo X celebrates his election with a party in Florence. Part of the celebration includes a young boy painted in gold. In the middle of the festivities, the boy dies from paint poisoning. Many see this death of the golden boy as a symbol of the apocalyptic prophecy preached by Savonarola, the embodiment of death by excess at the hands of the Catholic Church.
Pope Francis rapidly becoming known as the People's Pope.
Yeah, he takes the bus, as we've reported here. He pays his own bills.
Pope Francis is simply not interested in the power, wealth, influence aspect of the papacy at all. He gets up at 5 and he works till 10 p.m. So there's a kind of focus there that we admire, but if everybody was like that, the world would be horrible. The Renaissance popes did things very, very differently. They took a lot of holidays, they partied. And they created beauty. But the beauty was paid for with sin.
The Borgias, the Della Roveres, the Medicis, and the murderous power-hungry families that shape Renaissance Italy bring the church to a breaking point. By the end of the 16th century, their blind ambition, fierce loyalty, and frivolous spending has bankrupted the church financially and spiritually.
What they did with power, it's obviously incompatible with the figure of Jesus in the Gospels. And yet, when you stand in front of Michelangelo's Pietà in the Vatican, or Raphael's frescoes, what do you say? Do you take a hammer to them? Or do you say they have nothing to do with Christianity?
The finance and the corruption and the creativity are in a queasy relationship to each other all the way through this extraordinary moment in history.
There can be no way to untangle the corruption of the Renaissance with the beauty and discovery that has come out of it. Much of the power of today's Vatican lies in the diplomatic positions set up by the Borgia Pope and the tourism attracted by the works of art commissioned by the Della Roveres and the Medicis.
What has been erected are these extraordinary gifts to all of humanity so that the church is like a repository of beauty. How can we have this magnificent art repository and architecture of St. Peter's and then the corrupt actions of individuals? And yet the church is both.
The duality of the Renaissance lies within every facet of the modern church. One of the most powerful men on earth holds a position that has existed for nearly 2,000 years. As the world changes and faith evolves, his authority remains. What began with one apostle has become 1.2 billion followers under one man. He is the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope. And this is his path to power. In this episode, Never before seen orders from Pope Leo X and Henry VIII sever Protestants from the Catholic Church. And the corruption of Renaissance popes push three men to ignite a revolution that transforms Christianity forever.
Doy gracias a Dios por esta conmemoración conjunta de los 500 años de la Reforma que estamos viviendo con espíritu renovado, porque reconocemos que entre nosotros es mucho más lo que nos une que lo que nos separa.
In 2016, Pope Francis kicks off the 500-year anniversary of the Reformation, a spiritual revolution that splinters the once universal Catholic Church.
The Reformation, it's incredibly pivotal in the development of Christianity.
The Reformation could have been one of the big tragedies of Christianity, but rather you get the emergence of a much more individualized or personal faith.
The beginnings of the Reformation are all about this pushback against what is seen as excess in Rome.
In the 16th century, many Catholics are disturbed by the Church's pervasive materialism and corruption. As a result, new denominations of Christianity begin to form and break ties with the Vatican.
The Reformation is an anonymous bomb dropped on the theological landscape.
All great religions of the world which are successful change, and Christianity is no exception to that rule.
The umbrella of modern Christianity includes over 800 million Protestants and 1.2 billion Catholics worldwide. But in the 16th century, Catholicism is the law of the land.
There is a ferment of devotion, deep, deep piety in Europe. Everyone went to church out of conviction.
Almost the entire population of Europe devoutly follows Rome's Catholic doctrine. And the Pope is at the head of it all.
In the 16th century, there had been a series of very worldly popes who loved power.
All earthly institutions are flawed. And the Renaissance popes got caught up with power.
It's not surprising that people who loved power took it.
But as papal power swells, so does a culture of greed and corruption. The tenets of Christ begin to fall by the wayside as popes spend exorbitant amounts of money in the name of luxury, excess, and absolute power.
Popes during the Renaissance bring a sense of majesty into the papacy that had not existed before, even though we would probably say that their methods were a little bit ruthless.
And in 1513, Pope Leo X takes the overindulgence to new heights.
Leo X was an extravagant pope, very interested in architecture and the glories of the city of Rome, and spent a lot of money in pursuits of that kind.
The church has become one of the key commissioners of this huge, exciting cultural explosion, which is the Renaissance.
Pope Leo X throws lavish parties and hires Raphael to paint elaborate frescoes throughout the Vatican. He spends a small fortune on the palatial expansion of St. Peter's Basilica.
During the Renaissance, you had lots of art, lots of patronage, but in another way, it's dire for the church because they were actually breaking the church.
That art, that sculpture, all of that fabulous beauty has to be paid for.
Pope Leo X pays for his opulent lifestyle by selling positions within his administration.
He says, these offices will cost this much. If you want this one, you'll have to pay this much.
all kinds of horrible things that are happening in the church. They're selling their bishoprics, they're putting their illegitimate kids into offices, basically embezzlement.
This is the time the Catholic Church is really pretty profoundly corrupt.
But the payoffs are still not enough to keep up with Leo's spending.
It's put a strain on local churches and parishes. People are giving up lots of money during this time period, and they're feeling pressed.
Only 2 years into Leo X's papacy, the Vatican is on the verge of bankruptcy. In order to save the church from financial ruin, he charges his clergy with selling indulgences throughout all of Europe.
Indulgence, the forgiveness of sins in return for cash payments.
Indulgences started way back in the Crusades, and the idea was that you've got these soldiers fighting for Christ, and they're likely to be killed at any moment. And so what the church did was to give them a get-out-of-purgatory free card. So the indulgence was a way of rewarding people who were doing something good for God. But the trouble was that this system grew, and very soon people were being offered indulgences for sale.
Leo X realizes not only will the sale of indulgences deepen the pockets of the Catholic Church, but it will also fund the expensive construction of St. Peter's Basilica.
People go to St. Peter's now and they think about, how did they get all the money to build this? Well, they were taxing people with indulgences.
The whole thing about the St. Peter's indulgence was that it was applicable to your dead relatives. So you could get your relatives out of purgatory by paying for an indulgence.
It's a very seductive idea, a very successful idea.
But as word of the Pope's campaign for indulgence sales spreads throughout Europe, it triggers a reaction from a fundamentalist professor in Germany.
Martin Luther heard about this and found it obscene.
Martin Luther, a 33-year-old friar deeply devoted to the Bible, is appalled by the exploitive nature of indulgences.
Martin Luther felt that this was selling God's salvation for money, and you can't do that.
It's the notion of indulgences that finally bring the church down.
As Vatican culture sinks deeper into the pits of corruption, Martin Luther begins to ignite an extraordinary revolution. In 1517, despite the deep piety of European Catholics, materialism and corruption run rampant inside the Vatican walls. But in Germany, one man decides that it's time to take a stand against the sins of the Pope.
Martin Luther was a member of an order of friars called the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine.
Luther was a professor of scripture. He'd become a monk out of fear. He'd made a vow to St. Anne during a thunderstorm.
Early in his career, Martin Luther was sent off to Rome by his religious order, and he was shocked by Rome.
A deeply religious scholar, Martin Luther is horrified by the hedonism he sees funded by indulgences. He is outraged by the fact that the Pope is exploiting his followers' fear of damnation for financial gain.
Martin Luther felt that the God he found in the works of Augustine forgave sin and didn't actually consider individual sins. He made a free, merciful decision to forgive those who loved him. Luther found that God loved him, and he wanted to spread this message of God's love, as well as the message that you and I, people like us, human beings, are all sinful. There's nothing we can do about that.
For Luther, the sale of indulgences was exactly the antithesis of this sense of Christianity as a liberating mode. Salvation not as free gift, but as something you have to stump up money for.
Martin Luther thought it was all a sham. he decided to hold a seminar about indulgences. And he would issue 95 things to be discussed in this seminar. The seminar never happened. But the 95 theses, the 95 ideas to be discussed, were there.
Martin Luther sends his 95 theses to the Archbishop of Mainz, Germany, who then sends it to the Pope. In his theses, Luther questions the indulgences and whether the Pope should have power over who goes to heaven or hell.
The theses are a series of technical questions about whether or not, for example, the Pope or any priest has jurisdiction in the afterlife. There were a lot of Catholic theologians who thought the afterlife was in God's world and papal authority was for this world.
It's often said that he nailed the document with these 95 theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg.
This was not the first time that these ideas had been put out. Far from it. But the difference between 1517 and the 14th century is the printing press. The 95 theses were printed and they were widely distributed.
Martin Luther had become a celebrity in all Europe. He was producing books and finding a real talent. He's one of the first great bestseller writers in print.
Luther was a master of popular media.
Previously, the printing press had only been used to circulate scripture and official documents. Martin Luther is the first to use it to spread a subversive message.
Martin Luther's revolution was fueled by the printing press, and he used it with genius. But that brought a real problem. Now he was the symbol of all sorts of different discontents, and he'd aroused passions which he couldn't control all through Europe, and now Europe was split.
Martin Luther's statements against the sale of indulgences put him in direct opposition to Pope Leo X, who was frantically selling them to cover his debts.
Church leaders were now saying to Luther, you must obey the Pope, and to obey, you must keep quiet. And Luther could not keep quiet. If you were the enemy of the church, that would mean you could be called a heretic. So Martin Luther was putting himself in very dangerous territory now.
Deep within the Vatican secret archive lies the document that split the once universal Catholic Church. It has never before been seen on camera. On January the 3rd, 1521, Pope Leo X issues a papal order excommunicating the German preacher.
All Germany was in uproar, and this was very bad news for the overall ruler of Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V.
Acutely aware of the fervor Luther has ignited in Germany, Charles V worries his excommunication might start a revolt.
And what he did was to summon Martin Luther to a meeting of the Parliament of the Empire. It's called the Diet, and it was meeting that year in the city of Worms. What the emperor was going to do was to order him to be obedient to the church. So imagine this great set piece, all the great figures of the Holy Roman Empire there, bishops, princes, a vast crowd in attendance. And there the emperor told Luther to be obedient to the church. Luther said he could not be obedient. He must be obedient to the Bible, to Scripture.
Rather than being willing to investigate these ideas, the Catholic Church took a turn in the other direction and erected walls. Martin Luther is officially marked as being outside of the tradition of the Catholic Church. It was seen as an act of disloyalty. To be Protestant meant that you weren't loyal to the Pope.
After Luther's defiance of King Charles and the Pope at the Diet of Worms, a hard line is drawn among Christians.
The foundation of the Reformation is that the church is the invisible gathering of all of those who confess Christ in every time and in every place. And because this is not a temporal group of people, there's no way there can be a temporal head of it.
Those aligned with Martin Luther protest the Pope's divine claim to leading the Catholic Church and become known as Protestants. They build Lutheran churches throughout Germany and Scandinavia, focusing their teachings on Scripture instead of loyalty to the Pope.
In the past, when people don't want to receive Catholicism, people could be burned for heresy, you could be tortured, you could be in prison. Martin Luther's not the first person that challenged the church, but he's probably the first person to live to tell about it.
Martin Luther goes into hiding, and the Protestant Reformation continues to grow. In 1523, 2 years after the Diet of Worms, a new Pope, Clement VII, is elected. Unlike Leo X, Clement VII agrees with many of Luther's ideas about reform, posing a threat to the wealthy monarchs who benefit from church corruption. After Martin Luther denounces the Pope in 1521, European Christians are split in two. Lutherans develop their own church, founded on the belief that salvation is achieved through faith alone, while Catholics continue to practice obedience to the Vatican. But the abandonment of Catholicism by half of Europe presents Pope Clement VII with a dilemma.
Clement VII must have been sorry he was ever elected Pope, because his whole reign was a calamity.
He was chronically indecisive. He would go to bed for days with headaches and stomach aches rather than make a serious decision.
Not only is Pope Clement VII faced with a church that Martin Luther has splintered, but he is also caught in the middle of territory disputes between kings.
The papacy functions politically as one element in the cockpit of Europe, where all around it, dynastic politics are being worked out.
In 1527, the Vatican is still aligned with the King of Germany, Charles V, who stood with Pope Leo X against Luther just 6 years earlier.
Charles V was a very unusual person. He was the King of Germany. He ruled the north of Italy. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, but he had also inherited the rule of Spain. So he had more power than, at this point, any temporal monarch had ever had at any point. He was a very alarming monarch to many people.
He wants Italy at the same time that the French want Italy.
In an attempt to balance the power in Europe, Pope Clement VII abandons his alliance with Charles and makes a secret treaty with France called the League of Cognac.
As if the Pope hadn't got enough problems by the late 1520s, he found himself at war with the greatest Catholic in Europe, Charles V, the very man who challenged Luther.
There is one ruler, the King of France, who's behind the Pope, and then the King of Germany is against the Pope. So there's this war between the Church and Germany, but it's really between the King of Germany and the King of France.
Now, Charles V invaded Italy and invaded Rome. Rome was sacked by the imperial troops, many of whom were Lutherans and hated the Pope. And so for weeks on end, Rome faced terror. It's the most extraordinary irony that it was a Catholic who did as much harm to the Pope as a Protestant.
In May of 1527, the German army storms the churches, monasteries, and palaces in Rome. By the end of that spring, more than 8,000 Romans are slaughtered. Horrified by the carnage, Pope Clement VII flees the Vatican and seeks safety.
He gets away by sneaking out of the city.
The Pope hides out in a castle outside of Rome for 5 weeks, but eventually the German army surrounds his refuge. Clement VII is forced to surrender to King Charles V.
There was certainly no intention to kill the Pope. Why would you do that to the Holy Father? But what the Emperor wanted was to make the Pope helpless. And he did so. And now the Emperor had him at his mercy.
After Clement VII yields significant papal territory to Charles V, he retreats to a deserted palace in Orvieto, Italy. Church business slowly resumes, until the Pope finds himself clashing with another powerful monarch in a feud that will change the reach of the Catholic Church forever. After King Charles of Germany attacks Rome in 1527, the city is in ruins.
After that, it took half a century to rebuild Rome.
The Rome is destroyed, and half of Europe has abandoned Catholicism for Lutheranism. The Pope is determined to strengthen what's left of the Catholic Empire. But despite his best efforts to revive the splintering church, another threat to papal power brews in England.
Henry VIII was a fascinating, extremely complicated individual.
Henry VIII had the biggest ego in the Kingdom of England. He was also a clever man, talented, good-looking when he was young. And like many teenagers, he never quite coped with growing up.
Henry VIII has ruled England since he was 18 years old, and as a young, charismatic monarch, he is used to getting what he wants.
Henry was married to the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain.
The wife was a Spanish princess.
Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon is the foundation of many important political alliances. But despite the advantages attached to their union, Henry finds his marriage to Catherine problematic.
They'd been together for 20 years, and she had managed to produce one living daughter.
He was very sensitive to the fact that he hadn't got a son to take over when he died. And that was fatal in the politics of a kingdom at the time.
Not only does Henry want a son that his wife cannot give him, but he also has a mistress that he'd like to marry.
If you want to marry somebody else, there is no divorce. You need the Pope to annul your marriage.
He wants the Pope to say that he can marry Anne Boleyn.
He needs a declaration that his marriage to Catherine was never valid.
The Vatican archives contain the letter Henry VIII sent to Pope Clement VII, requesting the annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1530. His request is signed by 81 members of Parliament. But the Pope's response is complicated by his political alliances.
The Pope was effectively the prisoner of the Emperor Charles V, who, as it happens, was the nephew of Queen Catherine of England.
Clement VII does not want to jeopardize his fragile truce with Charles V by agreeing to his aunt's annulment. But King Henry threatens to withdraw all of England from the Catholic Church if he does not get his way.
So on the one hand, there was the King of England saying, declare my marriage null, or the church will suffer for it, because the stream of money from England to the papacy will be cut off. And on the other hand, was the Emperor Charles V says, if you divorce my auntie, you will suffer for it.
Pope Clement is in a precarious position and finds himself paralyzed with indecision. But King Henry VIII is not known for his patience.
Clement used various little tricks, delaying tactics, and the thing just dragged on and on and on. And Henry finally just got fed up with it and said, I'm just doing this on my own.
In the decade after Martin Luther's revolution, a school of thought circulates around Europe, doubting the Pope's divine right to power.
Henry VIII availed himself of this very strong current of Reformation thought that said the Pope is not the head of the Christian Church. The Christian Church is invisible. The Christian Church is all believers everywhere, and the Pope has no particular claim to be the leader. He took that Reformation thought, and then he entirely corrupted it by saying, the Pope is not the leader of the Christian Church, I am. Which was not at all what the Reformers had in mind.
Henry VIII says, I'm going to do an act of supremacy and I'm going to declare myself over the church.
Henry says, I'm not a king, I'm an emperor, and emperors are accountable to nobody.
In 1534, 4 years after Henry VIII's initial request for an annulment, he denounces the papacy, removing himself and his country from the jurisdiction of the Catholic Church. He proclaims himself the leader of a new church, the Church of England.
Henry says, I decide that I'm not married to Catherine.
He divorces his nice Catholic wife, he marries Anne Boleyn, and now he's the head of a church. So he can take down Catholic priests, he can put down people who don't follow his particular faith, the Anglican faith, and as a result, it ends up destroying the Catholic Church for a time in England.
He tore the kingdom apart with his break from Rome.
We have wars of religion within England. We have wars of religion between France and England, with France being more loyal to the Pope, England more loyal to Henry. The entire religious landscape becomes weaponized.
And then Henry VIII begins to take the church's wealth.
As head of the Church of England, Henry VIII seizes property that belongs to the Catholic Church.
He begins to strip all the altars in England. He takes that wealth for himself.
He dissolves the monasteries and convents, stripping over 12,000 monks, nuns, and priests of their homes and assets.
Henry's very puzzling in terms of religion.
Henry VIII had the alliances. He had the wealth to be able to disregard the Pope. To be able to say, no, I don't care if you put my entire country under interdict, meaning that everybody's excommunicated. This makes no difference to me. Essentially, he stripped away the authority of the papacy, and originally at least kept almost everything else, simply establishing a new church with a different head, and that authority was what he was most interested in. Who is at the head of it?
In the face of spiritual revolutionaries and power-hungry monarchs, the once almighty Pope sees the power of the office dwindle for the first time in nearly 800 years. By the middle of the 16th century, it looks as if the reign of the Roman Catholic Church is finally coming to an end. By the end of Pope Clement VII's reign in 1534, the once all-powerful Catholic Church is beginning to splinter. The new Pope, Paul III, inherits a papacy swelling with uncertainties.
Just at the moment when the church seemed in real trouble, a particular champion came along. He called himself Ignatius Loyola.
There were a group of French, Spanish, and Portuguese students at the University of Paris. They came under the influence of Ignatius.
At the University of Paris, Ignatius and his followers initiate a new way of praying based on meditation. In the past, Catholic prayer had consisted of standard recitations, but Ignatius promotes a more personalized practice.
He had developed a way of praying and focusing that was very attractive to these young men. So they all came together and they took vows together.
They called this society the Society of Jesus. They've been known as the Jesuits.
Like Martin Luther, Ignatius and the Jesuits believed that every man, not just clergy, should have an individual relationship with God. But unlike Martin Luther, they do not pose a direct threat to the church.
He had a lot in common with Luther. Ignatius was a man who believed that a direct communication with God was not only possible, but was absolutely essential for the soul to prosper. Too often, I think we tend to break down Catholic and Protestant, especially during the Reformation, into Catholics thought that people needed a mediator between God and man, and Protestants say, no, you can speak directly to God. Ignatius was a Catholic who believed that the direct experience of God was one of the most important experiences that the church could steer you towards.
They begin trying to rehabilitate fallen women, sex workers. They show great concern for the poor. Eventually, they go to Rome with this new idea for a new order, and they place themselves at the disposition of the Pope.
Ignatius presents the Jesuits' ideas to Pope Paul III as a means of Catholic reform. But in 1540, few had challenged the Catholic Church and remained in the good graces of the Pope.
The church hierarchy was feeling its way forward. This was an unknown new development. It was a new threat. Even though Luther's thought was condemned, within the Catholic Church, there was also this recognition that, yes, there were reforms that needed to be made.
The Pope allowed them to become a formal religious order.
In an unprecedented act, Pope Paul III endorses Ignatius's challenges to the Church. He permits the Jesuit order to flourish within Catholicism.
Ignatius knew how to play Vatican's politics. The society has always carefully cherished its independence and done so and protected that independence by talking about its loyalty to the Pope.
They become the largest religious order in the church.
The Jesuits make a name for themselves by shifting their focus to universal education.
The Jesuits focus on education for all classes of society.
They provided a first-class education, and people rushed to get that education. That's what spread the Catholic faith back into areas where Protestantism had made great strides.
Ignatius had 16 more years to live, and during that period, the Jesuits mushroomed. They took in more and more and more people.
They began to spread out through the New World and also into Japan and India and other places.
Inspired by the Jesuits, Pope Paul III calls for Catholic unity to fight against the ever-growing Protestant movement.
There's tremendous turmoil that is going on in the church. And so this becomes a time in which the church has to look to rebuild. And how does the church rebuild? What do? How do they bring themselves together?
In 1545, the Pope assembles the Council of Trent to re-examine the Catholic institution. A counter-reformation is born.
A council is called to start to do reforms in the church that they believe must be done in order to hold on to the church in the ways in which they can push back against Luther and these other Reformation movements.
Paul III. He's a great reforming pope. He makes a series of magnificent appointments to the cardinalate. And these men become the leaders of the renewal of Catholicism in the mid-16th century. And they're his men.
A transformation begins. In 1567, the sale of indulgences is outlawed, and a culture of change and growth is initiated in the church, setting the stage for the first Jesuit pope, and perhaps the greatest reformer of the modern era, Pope Francis. Nearly 600 years after the Reformation ignites in Europe, Pope Francis becomes the first Jesuit pope, a leader who calls on Christians to be missionaries of hope.
A Jesuit is the last person you would ever think was going to become pope.
Right from the start, the Society of Jesus set its face against any member of the society becoming pope.
They are not supposed to seek ecclesiastical benefits. They should not want to be bishops or cardinals or things like that.
Why now, for the very first time in the church's history, a Jesuit pope?
The unprecedented election of a Jesuit pope signifies a real shift in the nature of the 2,000-year-old office.
Pope Francis positions himself not just the leader of the Catholic Church and the papacy, but as a moral leader.
The Jesuits are the great success story of the Catholic reform. Jesuits are flexible thinkers. They understand that there are different sides to a question. They tend to be more lenient in their moral judgments. They tend to be more encouraging. So the impact of having a Jesuit pope is interesting.
It almost suggests the society felt that Jesuits to the rescue. The church was in trouble, and so they'd send one of their own in.
Pope Francis's election in 2013 comes during a turbulent time for Catholicism. The Vatican faces scrutiny for sexual and financial scandals, while both church and seminary attendance are on the decline the world over.
Change happens in the Catholic Church in a way that it doesn't happen in other places. It never happens directly. Emphasis gets changed, certain things are dropped from attention, and they pivot.
Pope Francis asked me to take on this job in culture about 1.5 years ago. And he spoke to me about what he wanted me to do. Pope Francis said, look, there are things changing in our world. There are things emerging that have potential to shape our future very differently. He said, I want you to get out there. I want you to meet the people who are forging the future of the world.
The changes initiated during the Reformation have become part of the fabric of modern Christianity. More than 900 million Protestants around the world can trace their spiritual roots back to the revolution started in the 1500s.
The shattering of the unity of Christendom was a tragedy. But it also, of course, created a new kind of urgency for Catholic reform.
After 2,000 years of threats, transformations, and revolutionaries, the Pope still maintains a following of 1.2 billion people around the world. The capacity of the Catholic Church to accept change has been central to its ability to remain relevant.
Reforming helped to bring about a renewal of the papacy and of the wider church.
We can see how the papacy first changes, but secondarily how it has to change with the time that it's in. Where there might have been a time that, science is bad and it's all terrible, Pope Francis has been able to speak about things like homosexuality, the environment, in ways in which other popes have not. We're now in a time where somebody like Pope Francis is saying climate change is real. We need to take care of the earth. So I think that's a tremendous way to sort of look at the papacy, to see how it has to develop over time, not just about the faith, but about the world in which it's dealing with.
One of the most powerful men on earth, holds a position that has existed for nearly 2,000 years. As the world changes and faith evolves, his authority remains. What began with one apostle has become 1.2 billion followers under one man. He is the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope. And this is his path to power. In this episode, choices in the face of war leave an indelible mark on the papacy. While the world debates sainthood for one of the most controversial popes of the modern era, history is forced to consider, did the Catholic Church do enough? Pope Francis is the third sitting pope to visit a Nazi death camp. On July 29, 2016, he makes an historic visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. In this camp alone, the Nazis put more than 1 million people to death.
According to Catholic teaching today, anti-Semitism is a sin. Jewish people are to be respected. They're not to be converted. They have their own relationship with God. But this was a Christian society that somehow was able to view Jews as enough of an other, an outsider, that they could live with this.
Pope Francis's visit to Auschwitz immerses the pontificate in a harrowing time in both world and church history. Faced with the haunting images of the Holocaust, Pope Francis is confronted by the legacies of his predecessors.
The question is not only what we think the Pope did during the Second World War and during the Holocaust, but what we think the Pope should have done.
Pope Pius XII is a polarizing figure. Many praise his bravery in the face of fascism, while others believe he could have done more.
There's a controversial move to canonize Pius XII, to have him declared a saint. I think the real crux of the issue is whether the actions of this Pope in the midst of one of the great tragedies of human history, whether that's the stuff of the Vicar of Christ. Is that the stuff of a saint?
The controversy surrounding Pius XII begins long before he ever becomes Pope. From 1917 to 1929, Eugenio Pacelli, the future Pope Pius XII, serves as a papal ambassador stationed in Germany.
Pacelli was tapped by the Vatican to try to go to Germany to bring an end to World War I. He didn't bring an end to the war, but he stayed in Germany. He was helping displaced persons, injured persons. And then the soldiers come back.
Because of World War I and Germany losing World War I, Germany was in a state of chaos. And as a result, there was political unrest, there was revolution.
You've got a bunch of young men who don't have jobs, and they feel like they were betrayed by their country, and there's this violence in the streets. They start forming these organizations that eventually morph into the Nazis.
Oppressive government regimes across Europe gained traction by blaming outsiders, immigrants, and Jews for the post-war economic and political crisis. In 1922, Benito Mussolini leads the National Fascist Party to a victory in Italy, while Hitler and the Nazis rise to power in Germany, where Pacelli is stationed. New Pope Pius XI is faced with unprecedented unrest.
Pius XI was an interesting pope. A diplomat, very experienced in international politics, and he saw the evil of Nazism.
The Nazi Party stands firmly as anti-religion, putting Jews and Catholics in their crosshairs. Alarmed by what he sees happening in Nazi Germany, Pius XI implores Pacelli to be his eyes and ears on the ground.
Hitler's in Munich, and the future Pope Pius XII is in Munich at the same time. He sees Hitler seizing power, and he's reporting back to Rome about what's going on.
Pius XI and Eugenio Pacelli had a very unique relationship. Pacelli was really, really critical in helping to steer much of the major decisions that Pius XI made. Pius XI asked Eugenio Pacelli to become his Secretary of State, and so Pacelli becomes effectively the second most powerful man in the government of the Church.
As fascism explodes all over Europe, Catholics become enemies of the state.
The thing about Catholics in particular, Catholics had a relationship, a devotion to something outside of government.
There's going to be conflict over the status of Catholic youth groups and whether these youth groups ought to be brought under the umbrella of fascist organizations.
There are some Catholic bishops who were beaten, who had their homes and their offices ransacked.
The church, of course, to be able to operate, has to be physically secure.
The Vatican is faced with an extraordinary dilemma. Because of his experience as a papal diplomat, Pope Pius XI enlists Pacelli's help to negotiate with the fascist Italian government. The result is the Lateran Treaty.
Italy and the Vatican reached an agreement to allow the church to function, allow the Pope to feel secure when he left the Vatican itself.
1929 is really a milestone. The Italian government at this point is a dictatorship in the hands of Benito Mussolini, and the Lateran Treaty returns to the Pope territorial sovereignty, which meant independence.
The Lateran Treaty made Vatican City into an independent nation state.
In exchange for Vatican autonomy, the Pope agrees to halt all opposition to Mussolini's regime. The 1929 agreement sets a precedent. The Church is willing to negotiate with dictators in exchange for sovereignty. In 1929, the Vatican signs the Lateran Treaty, an agreement with Mussolini establishing autonomy for the Church in exchange for political neutrality.
It gave the Church a hold on Italian society.
From the Pope's perspective, it's a major victory, but there's a price to be paid. I mean, Mussolini gets something for having given something. Part of the deal was that the Church was to remain outside of politics.
With Church opposition out of the way, Mussolini's fascist government flourishes.
The Lateran Treaty, it's a major step in the consolidation of the fascist dictatorship, because one of the things Mussolini is able to do, in fact, is turn to a population that is largely Catholic and show that, in fact, he's made peace with the spiritual leader of the church.
While Mussolini and the church mutually benefit from their peace in Italy, Adolf Hitler is elected Chancellor of Germany, and Nazism becomes the law of the land.
Jews were a target almost immediately. January 30th, Adolf Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. The first anti-Jewish law is April 1st. And the Nazi movement not only was anti-Semitic, they were anti-communist, anti-socialist, anti-Catholic. For Catholics, suddenly they couldn't join their youth group organization without fighting with the local Nazi youth. Their schools would be confiscated. Day-to-day violence was an everyday occurrence from 1933 onward.
After the success of the Lateran Treaty, Pope Pius XI looks again to Eugenio Pacelli to help him defend Catholics in the face of another increasingly troubling dictator. In July 1933, Pacelli negotiates another treaty, this time with the German government, called the Reichskonkordat.
Like the Lateran Treaty, this was a defensive measure. The state says, okay, we will allow the church control over its affairs, but the price to be paid is that the church is not to be involved in politics. It's a controversial agreement. Some see it as sort of a pact with the devil. It effectively takes the Catholic Church out of the political realm at the moment when opposition to an evolving dictatorship was more needed than ever.
It was a fatal stepping back from confronting pure evil.
Although the Reichskonkordat officially prevents the Vatican from working against Hitler, many German Catholics refuse to stay silent.
An anonymous woman in Dusseldorf writes to Pius XI, and she says, I'm walking along in the streets day to day, and children are beating up their Jewish neighbors. How can we be good, moral thinking Catholics with this going on around us?
Despite the tenets of the agreement, Nazis continue to interfere in Catholic life. Nuns and priests continue to be arrested, and Hitler passes sterilization laws, which stand in diametric opposition to Catholic doctrine.
Because, of course, Hitler was not a man you could ever trust. And, of course, you could never do a deal with Hitler.
And yet the Vatican just stays on course. We have a treaty, we have a treaty, we have a treaty.
And so the oppression of the church went on. And it got worse. Infinitely, horribly worse.
As the 1930s wear on, Hitler's dictatorship becomes more and more violent. A litany of anti-Jewish laws are passed, including a boycott of all Jewish businesses. Enemies of the state, including Catholic priests, are put on trains to labor camps.
The concentration camp at Dachau, some have described it as the world's biggest seminary. At one point in time, there were thousands of Catholic priests there.
2,500 Catholic priests died at Dachau. Not Catholics, Catholic priests. At this point, there's no way that the Church and the Third Reich are going to get along.
The Vatican writes more than 50 complaints to Nazis about violations of the Reichskonkordat. But Pius XI does not speak out publicly against Hitler.
The latter part of the 1930s, Pius XI began to prepare himself and began to prepare the church for some kind of direct confrontation with the fascist regimes.
He distrusted Hitler. He was also opposed to racism. He was personally not very friendly to the Jews. He shared the very widespread Christian belief that the Jews as a people had been responsible for Jesus' death, but he thought that that didn't mean you had a right to invade their human rights, and in fact wrote an encyclical condemning it.
In 1937, Pius XI enlists Pacelli's help yet again. He drafts an encyclical regarding the situation in Germany.
An encyclical is the most formal statement from the Vatican. It's the highest statement a pope can make.
Pope Pius XI calls his 1937 German encyclical Mit brennender Sorge, which means with burning concern. In it, he condemns racism from a theological perspective.
It was talking about how it's foolish to think that God would lock all of what is great in humanity into a single race.
With the Nazis on high alert for any subversive activity, the Vatican uses a secret courier network to smuggle the encyclical into Germany.
It was read from the pulpits in Catholic churches throughout Germany on Palm Sunday.
It was the only time that the whole of Germany heard a denunciation of the regime from pulpits, an extraordinarily brave thing to do.
But the papal risk is a measured one. Although the encyclical denounces racism, it fails to mention Hitler or the Nazi Party by name.
It's a document that bears Pacelli's hand. He is ever mindful of the need and of the desire to try to maintain diplomatic relationship. So it's an interesting sort of doctrinal statement that perhaps lacks some of the political punch that hour called for.
Regardless of its ambiguous language, Hitler sends Gestapo into every German church to confiscate the document.
Anyone who said it, printed it, repeated it, possessed it, was getting arrested or getting beat up, or the property was being seized. That kind of fear of retaliation. That's what Hitler played upon.
In 1938, Hitler's regime expands into Austria. More anti-Semitic laws are passed. More Jewish homes and businesses are destroyed. And still, the Vatican remains publicly neutral. But on the night of November 9th, 1938, Germany will explode in violence, marking a sinister shift in the Nazi agenda that the world will not be able to ignore. In the 2 years after Pope Pius XI releases his anti-racism encyclical, the Vatican remains publicly silent about Hitler's growing fascist regime. And on the eve of November 9th, 1938, Nazi violence against the Jews reaches a fever pitch.
Kristallnacht was the night of shattered glass. It's the night when the Nazis went to the Jewish businesses, the synagogues, and smashed everything.
30,000 Jewish men were sent to a concentration camp. It was a very public, violent attack on Jews, and after that it was game over.
Bishops from all over Europe write to the Vatican Secretary of State Eugenio Pacelli demanding a response to the violence in Germany.
The primate of the Catholic Church in England wrote to Pacelli and said, "We need to be clear that this is Nazi terrorism against Jews. Can you make a statement?" And Pacelli writes back saying, well, it's a difficult issue, and what we need to do is just issue a statement of general love and concern and mercy for all in a universal way.
In January 1939, Hitler makes a bone-chilling speech threatening the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. And more men, women, and children are sent to concentration camps. Despite the Vatican's neutrality treaties, Pope Pius XI can no longer remain silent.
It's quite clear that when Pius XI was dying, he was about to denounce fascism in quite explicit terms.
Pius XI begins to draft On the Human Race, an encyclical in which he condemns anti-Semitism. But he dies before it is ever released. Now, with Europe on the brink of another war, the cardinals must elect a new pope.
The conclave of 1939 comes, of course, at a critical moment. It's very clear that Nazi foreign policy is becoming increasingly aggressive, and so the election of a new pope garners a great deal of interest, well beyond the Catholic world.
Pius XI had clearly groomed Pacelli to become the next pope.
After a conclave lasting less than 24 hours, Vatican Secretary of State Eugenio Pacelli is sworn in as Pope. He chooses to call himself Pius XII to honor his mentor.
One of the things that made Pacelli the right choice at this point in time was that all the rival parties believed that he was in their camp. He was, as it were, all things to all men.
He was widely recognized for his diplomatic skill. It was seen that, given that the world was in a state of such tension, that a diplomat pope and one who had considerable experience in international affairs might be in order.
As tensions in Europe continue to rise, Pope Pius XII is faced with a daunting task. He must navigate the role of a religious leader in an increasingly secular world.
I think it compels popes to ask themselves who they represent and for whom should they speak.
Pius XII was trained as a papal diplomat. He deeply internalized the doctrine that papacy functioned best as a neutral force. But can the papacy really be neutral in the face of Nazism?
6 months after his election, the Nazis invade Poland. And World War II is officially declared in Europe.
The Nazi invasion of Poland in September 1939 is catastrophic for Catholics. Poland is a Catholic country. Polish Catholics were dealt with very harshly. Priests were often murdered right on the spot. Women were raped. It was brutal, and the Vatican was receiving reports of this and cries for help.
This was a war against religion, against Jews, against Catholics, against anything that was non-German.
Pius XII is forced to re-examine his commitment to quiet diplomacy. With the Church under attack, it is up to the Pope to defend the faithful. Six months after Eugenio Pacelli is elected Pope, the Nazis invade Poland, catapulting Europe into World War II. Despite pressure from Allied forces, including US President Roosevelt, Pius XII's statements remain measured and neutral. Meanwhile, Hitler's agenda only grows in scope and horror.
The Nazis started a program to eliminate people with mental and physical disabilities. That eventually morphed into the final solution.
There was a decision to exterminate every Jewish man, woman, and child anywhere in Europe.
In the 1930s, Nazis had sent Jews, outspoken Catholics, communists, and the handicapped to concentration camps. But in 1940, Hitler opens Auschwitz-Birkenau, the first and most lethal of what will be 8 Nazi death factories. Camps engineered for the systematic mass murder of Jews. By the end of the war, more than 1 million Jews will perish in Auschwitz alone.
News, letters, and cables of exactly what the Nazi regime was doing went to and from the Vatican daily by the hundreds.
Many of his own reliable sources are telling him that the Nazis are engaged in a particularly cruel and unique campaign against Jews. He receives one memo from a military chaplain that begins simply, "The Jews, period, a dreadful situation, period," which dates to 1942.
The Vatican knew precisely what was going on. There was no better informed organization in Europe than the Vatican.
As the horrific images from Germany and Poland spread across the globe, the devout looked to the Pope for guidance. But ever the diplomat, Pius XII worries that action against Hitler might provoke more violence against Catholics.
If Pius XII spoke out, would it make things worse for Polish Catholics? Well, you can actually hardly make things worse for Polish Catholics.
As he himself says, I have to watch what I say because I want to avoid a greater evil. But what he can do, he will do. And a great example of the way Pius XII dealt with this question comes in the Christmas address of 1942.
Questo voto l'umanità lo deve agli innumerevoli morti che giacciono sepolti nei campi di guerra. Il sacrificio della loro vita nel compimento del loro dovere è l'olocausto.
In his Christmas address, broadcast internationally on Vatican Radio, Pope Pius XII makes one of his only public statements about the war. In it, he speaks for human rights and against racism. But he fails to mention Hitler, the Nazis, or the Jewish people by name.
He made a very generalized statement about the rights of people that he thought was all he needed to say about the Jewish question.
The bottom line was, even after violence against Jews, the decision in Rome was we're not going to name the Nazis and we're not going to name Jews. We're just going to offer universal love and charity. So it's another opportunity that was missed, and a critical one.
He worried a lot about the consequences of speaking out. One wonders, did he ever really think about the consequences of not speaking out?
Despite Pius XII's public neutrality, Hitler's march towards world domination reaches the Pope's doorstep. In September of 1943, Hitler invades Rome.
It was a situation where the Pope thought that they had an operating agreement, did not think this was going to happen, but about 2,000 Jews were rounded up.
The day of the roundup, the Pope says he doesn't want to have to come out and condemn explicitly Nazi behavior. It's obviously a veiled threat to do precisely that. But he says he doesn't want to do it. So the threat of a public condemnation is dangled, which tells us, in fact, that he and his men understand the power and the value of the Pope's words. And repeatedly, consistently, even as people are being rounded up, he declines to utter that clear word.
As the war rages outside the Vatican walls, Pius XII becomes a target. Rumors fly about a Nazi plan to kidnap the Pope.
Hitler actually got a general and told him to draw up plans to invade the Vatican. Pius XII gathered everyone together and essentially released them if they wanted to leave, but he also submitted a letter that was his resignation that said, if I'm captured, I resign the papacy. So they will not capture the Pope. They will capture Eugenio Pacelli, but not the Pope.
As bombs go off and Jews are rounded up right under the Pope's windows, Pius XII must take stock. His diplomatic efforts have failed, and the Vatican is now directly in Nazi crosshairs. In September 1943, Nazi troops invade Rome. An imminent attack on the Vatican looms, and more than 2,000 Roman Jews are rounded up for deportation to extermination camps. They are held at the Military College of Rome, mere blocks from St. Peter's Basilica. But despite the atrocities unfolding right at his doorstep, Pope Pius XII remains publicly silent.
He takes the path of diplomatic caution in terms of his public pronouncements, but it's not that the Pope was inactive. There is a view that the Pope worked behind the scenes to try to put an end to the roundup. There is some evidence, in fact, that that actually worked.
They got several Jews released primarily because they were married to a Catholic or they invoked the Concordat to help some of them avoid deportation.
He also then says, well, let's do what we can to alleviate suffering on the ground.
There were some Vatican trucks that would go around and take food and take blankets and try to bring additional supplies to where it was needed.
Some believe that Pope Pius XII's silence is a cover. That throughout the war, he is secretly involved with covert operations with the Allies.
The Pope did secretly tape his conversations. During the week of his election in 1939, the Vatican's tapes show quite clearly that he opted for public acquiescence with the Nazis and at the same time deciding that they must be resisted behind the scenes. Pius XII received information from a Vatican spy in Germany, and he passed this information on to the Western Allies.
Some historians even speculate about papal involvement in a plan to assassinate Hitler.
The key figure in the German resistance to Hitler was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of German military intelligence, whom, as it happens, Pacelli had met in the 1920s when he was in Germany. Canaris reached out to his old friend Pacelli and said, "Help me and help Germany get rid of Hitler." Canaris then had access to explosives.
Between 1940 and 1944, there would be 3 failed attempts to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Information about these plots is still shrouded in conspiracy theory, and documented proof of Pius XII's role is almost non-existent.
For a long time it wasn't known about because the Pope knew if he kept written records, it'd get people killed.
To be really clear, the Pope is not involved in any of the details. He does help to facilitate these contacts, plotting to remove Adolf Hitler. And that's important. It was risky. It was something that he kept from his closest advisors. And it shows us that for all of our understanding of him as very cautious and maybe too cautious, he could at times take some very bold and even risky actions.
Despite the uncertainty surrounding any papal involvement in a plan to kill Hitler, the Church's role in hiding Jews during the war is undeniable.
There's good, reliable evidence that church institutions, religious houses were used to rescue and house Jews.
There is even evidence that Jews were hidden on Vatican-owned properties.
There's some fascinating photographs where you see people not only sleeping on the floors in churches, not only in the hallways, but even on the staircases, up and down the staircases, 3 across.
Close to 6 million European Jews perished during World War II. But nearly 80% of the 12,000 Roman Jews survive.
A large percentage of Jews in Rome survive, in large part because of the actions of many of these religious houses.
The debate around that is, was there a central order to do this? Did Pius XII remain silent during the actual roundup, but secretly issue an order that as many Jews should be hidden as possible? And we've never found an order from Pius XII to shelter and hide Italian Jews. And there were even some cases where he was displeased because it put that particular religious order, or religious house, at risk.
Despite more than 70 years of retrospect, the pontificate of Pius XII is still veiled in mystery. Who was he, and does he deserve to be called a saint? To be canonized a saint is to be recognized as one who shares an eternal life with God in heaven. In the last 1,000 years, only 7 popes have been made saints. Reigning for nearly 2 decades, many Catholics see Pius XII as a prolific religious leader responsible for shaping the modern church. But as the world debates canonization for the wartime pope, we are forced to consider the holiness of his actions during one of the most turbulent times in world history.
The heart of the controversy really is whether his diplomatic caution saved lives. Those who advance his cause see that as an argument to make him a saint.
Pius XII is often excused for not having condemned the extermination of the Jews because, as he himself said, had he done so, it wouldn't have done any good and it might have made things worse. But I think it's hard to avoid the feeling that there was some kind of moral failure.
The crux of the debate lies in the character of Pope Pius XII. Who was he? And why did he make the decisions he did?
There are those who see in his reluctance to identify the suffering of Jews in particular. Some see in that the strains of anti-Semitism.
Eugenio Pacelli's time in Germany as a papal diplomat is really critical to his formation, his thinking about Germans and Germany, and one could argue his thinking about Jews. He describes meeting with Jewish officials who he describes as dirty communists with slanted eyes. We can see his negative stereotypes about Jews in his writings, and I'm not convinced they ever really exited his thinking.
The whole of Pius XII's papacy is dominated in our memory by questions. It seems a bit simple to say that there are evil people, good people, because most of us aren't actually one or the other. We're a mixture. It's much more complex.
But the complexities of Pope Pius XII are yet to be unraveled. Questions about what he did and did not do during the Holocaust remain unanswered.
We don't yet have access to all of the wartime archive, so we don't really have a full historical record for Pius XII.
Once they are available and scholars can make a determination of exactly what he did or didn't do, then we can say definitively what the record of Pius XII was. And before we can do that, it would be premature to move forward with sainthood.
Until the records are released, the world can only speculate. Polarized opinions color the emotional debate over the canonization of a deeply controversial historical figure.
If in fact he wanted to protect his own church and his own co-religionists in the face of the Holocaust, that decision had consequences. I think Pius XII was a human being who made mistakes, and maybe he didn't make the right decision in this case. And maybe that's a lesson for this church, that sometimes we don't make the right decision, and we need to atone, and we need to correct ourselves, and we need to do better in the future.
In 2016, as Pope Francis walked through the shadows of Auschwitz, he must face the legacy of his predecessors. He prays for the mistakes he has inherited and for the lessons that will carry the Church forward.
Pope Francis is a radically different kind of pope than the Catholic Church has seen for a long time. He has the rule of love, that's it. Love your neighbor. And if you're doing that, then you're a good Catholic.
Modern popes engage in politics at the highest level, regularly meeting with world leaders and taking meaningful stands against atrocity and injustice. John Paul II works tirelessly to end communism and help the African continent heal in the wake of colonialism and apartheid. Pope Francis continues in that brave legacy, a champion for human rights, unafraid to fight for the freedoms of the oppressed.
Francis and John Paul II have moved us on very significantly. They opened the door. Now the Vatican is actually a player in world politics, particularly in humanitarian aspects, and that's been an enormously important aspect of its ministry. During the Second World War, there was this sense that the Church was very different from the world. The Pope was isolated.
I'm a lifelong practicing Catholic who has worked for 17 years at the Holocaust Museum, and I'm a historian. And so it's difficult to just look clinically at a document where a Ukrainian Catholic shooter is taking a Jewish child by the neck and shooting them while their mother watches, and then going to church the following Sunday to see that Catholics have the capacity to set their faith to one side and be part of the Holocaust that destroyed 6 million families. And to this day, these families come to the museum and you can see that it goes generations deep. It makes one question, what is the point of my faith at all? What is the point of a pope leading a church where love and mercy is not paramount? And it makes you wonder.
In times of tragedy, humanity continues to wrestle with faith. The world looks to the Pope for guidance, and one of the most powerful men on earth holds a position that has existed for nearly 2,000 years. As the world changes and faith evolves, his authority remains. What began with one apostle has become 1.2 billion followers under one man. He is the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope. And this is his path to power. In this episode, a young man of faith challenges the tyranny of communism, changes the face of the Catholic Church, and reimagines the future of the oldest office on earth. John Paul II is perhaps the most recognizable pope of the modern era.
Deliver us, Lord, from every evil.
Often called the TV Pope, he brings the papacy directly into the homes of Catholics and non-Catholics alike. Over the course of his 28-year reign, John Paul II makes the Pope an international icon.
I would challenge anyone to think of the names of 2 or 3 popes before JP2. No pope, under any circumstance, has ever had the impact that JP2 had.
Before John Paul II, the papacy is a quiet vestige of an ancient tradition. Popes are religious figureheads atop a hill in Rome, notorious for their measured diplomacy in the face of war and injustice.
In the earlier part of last century, secular society wouldn't listen to papal authority, and the papacy became insulated.
The Pope seemed to be very far away. The Pope didn't seem to be involved in your everyday life.
But Karol Wojtyla, the young Polish scholar who will become John Paul II, changes the face of the Catholic Church forever.
His mother died when he was 8 years old. His brother died shortly after that. He was raised by his father in a very pious household. His father was a man of deep prayer, a man of piety. Wojtyla once referred to his home as his first seminary.
He prayed every day. There was a kneeler in their living room.
He was a very deeply spiritual and religious man, even as a young man.
In 1938, 18-year-old Wojtyla moves to Krakow to attend the Jagiellonian University.
Wojtyla, as a young man, wanted to be an actor.
He wants to study theater and literature, but he's only able to do that for a year.
The Nazis invade Poland.
World War II begins. It was the Nazis' goal to eviscerate Polish culture. So the Jagiellonian University in Krakow is closed.
With his life and country in turmoil, Wojtyla remains grounded in his faith and searches for a creative outlet.
He gathered together with others in an acting troupe that met in secret. It was really plays that combined religious and themes of Christ with anti-Nazi resistance.
They call it a rhapsodic theater.
But in February 1941, Wojtyla returns home to find his father, his only remaining relative, dead of a heart attack.
He writes at one point that at the age of 20, I lost everyone I ever loved. So he has to deal with this incredible adversity of the Nazis and no college to attend without any family members.
It is profoundly affecting this young man who is deeply religious. He wanted a different kind of Catholicism than just going to church on Sunday.
This becomes the catalyst for Karol Wojtyla to think about a vocation to the priesthood.
But he had to make up his mind. Did he want to be a priest, or did he want to be an actor? He decided that the priesthood was his calling.
He joins up with this underground seminary at great risk to his life. I think if these people were found out by the Nazis, they would probably be put to death.
As war rages around him, Wojtyla continues to study for the priesthood in secret. Until finally in 1945, the Allies liberate Poland and the Nazis flee. But as Polish society attempts to rebuild, a new regime rises to fill the political vacuum. The Soviet Communist government.
The Polish church had been almost destroyed under the Nazis, and then suppressed again under the communists.
Communism means the state rules over all, and that faith is frowned upon because that takes you away from the imperative of the good of the people. Your faith is put into the state instead of being put into God. People thought of communism as a religion in and of itself. And so for Karol Wojtyla, this becomes a very big deal.
Imagine being ruled in succession by Nazism and then suddenly by communism.
Religion is not outlawed, but the communist regime distributes anti-religious propaganda and continues persecuting clergymen.
The church in Eastern Europe had to operate silently under government control.
Wojtyla insisted that the person has priority over the state, but that was a message that was very unwelcome in communist Poland at the time. There is this defiance to take shape at a very early age.
Wojtyla holds secret masses in the mountains, preaching the importance of spirituality and religious freedom to his young congregation.
Karol Wojtyla would have been happy to be a parish priest for his whole life, but that wasn't to be.
Particularly because of his counseling to young people, he became greatly respected by the hierarchy of the Vatican.
In 1958, he is named Auxiliary Bishop of Krakow.
The other bishops and cardinals said this is someone who has a lot of promise.
And in 1962, the young bishop from Poland will make a splash at a Vatican council where he catches not only the attention of the Pope, but the entire world. The Catholic Church is an institution rooted in traditions of the past. But the 1960s are a time of radical social and political change.
This is the beginnings of when we start to see priests and nuns marching in the civil rights movement, nuns ditching their habits and wearing street clothes to teach.
The world is changing, and the church has to change to keep up with what's going on in the world. The church needed renewal, needed updating.
This is the first ecumenical council in 92 years, and only the second in 400 years. It is solemnly opened this Pope John.
In 1962, officials from all over the world gather in St. Peter's Basilica for a series of meetings that will shake the foundation of Catholicism. The event is called the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II.
Vatican II is the biggest story in the Catholic Church of the last 200 years. It called for a decentralization of church authority.
It suggested that the church might be run in different ways. It produced liturgy in which people could worship in their own languages. It also very cautiously began to think about the position of women in the church.
It called for an intensified dialogue with Protestants and with non-Christians. It called for a healing with the Jews, greater sensitivity in foreign missions to the local cultures. Total pivot of a church that for 200 years considered modernity suspect.
During Vatican II, Karol Wojtyla makes an impression on top Vatican officials.
Dear brothers and sisters, a warm welcome to you all.
He was an eager participant who often spoke.
He was able to take part in many of the debates about theology and ecclesiology. They came to recognize him as a man who could speak about the faith with courage and clarity. They came to appreciate his charismatic character, his personal magnetism.
In 1967, Wojtyla is appointed cardinal, adding momentum to his ongoing fight for religious freedom under communist tyranny in Poland.
He wanted to build a church in Nowa Huta, and the communists said no, but he wouldn't take no for an answer.
Wojtyla erects a large cross in the center of town. But communist authorities remove it. He erects another cross. And again, it is removed.
He was a very persistent man, so he's going to try everything in his power to get the church built.
The struggle goes on for a decade. But eventually, with the help of hundreds of volunteers, the church is built and becomes a symbol of unwavering faith in the face of communist persecution.
He was always trying to carve out space for church freedom.
He just believed that ultimately truth and justice are going to prevail.
Wojtyla had taken on the communists.
In August 1978, a new pope, John Paul I, is elected.
In an extraordinary turn of events, he has a massive heart attack, dies in his sleep.
John Paul I dies after 30 days. And you have to have another election immediately.
The cardinals saw the death of John Paul I as a message from God, that maybe they needed to think in a little bit more of an unconventional way. Why elect a non-Italian Slavic pope and make this radical change with the past?
And that election brings forth Karl Wojtyla, who comes to be John Paul II.
The conclave that elected him, they didn't know what they were going to get.
In October 1978, after a conclave lasting only 2 days, 58-year-old Karol Wojtyla takes the name John Paul II to honor his predecessor.
He was young, he was vigorous, boundless energy, and this tremendous sense of having survived 2 totalitarian regimes.
When he stepped out onto the Sacrato of St. Peter's,
Sia lodato Gesù Cristo.
and there's thousands and thousands of people there, and here was this young, energetic, confident pontiff who said, "Open your hearts to Christ." It was an extraordinary time.
Lontano.
The feeling in the square was one of amazement and some confusion. Who was this guy? Wojtyla.
The election of JP2 really just gave Poland an electrifying jolt forward.
Under the thumb of the Soviets, Karol Wojtyla had rarely been able to speak to large audiences. But as John Paul II, his inaugural papal address is broadcast all over the world. And on this stage, he gives a special message to his homeland.
He said, "Be not afraid."
Non abbiate paura.
The idea to the modern Pole in the late 1970s of "be not afraid" carried enormous impact. Don't pay any attention to those communist rats that are oppressing you.
Di vita eterna.
Now that he's pope, communists realized he was going to cause more problems for them.
With the power of the church at his disposal, Pope John Paul II prepares to face communism head-on. In 1978, the US and the Soviet Union reign as global superpowers. Communism and democracy stand at odds, and the world teeters on the edge of nuclear war. In the Vatican, a pope who came of age under Soviet oppression in Poland brings a fresh and hopeful voice to the world stage.
I can still remember the elation of his early years and the tremendous sense that God had sent us a megastar as Pope. He brought this vision to the church.
When Pope John Paul II was elected, he pushed the church's influence into areas where the church had never had a voice before.
The Vatican realizes that having its own media, they have a daily newspaper, Vatican Radio, they have a press office, it's another way to get the message out.
He took the papacy to the people. He became the evangelizer in chief.
Media and technology allow his pontificate to reach the furthest corners of the globe.
This was a real break with the past because popes kept to themselves. But Pope John Paul II was determined to get out there and let people see him. It marked a real change in the papacy.
His access is completely different kind of access. The Pope became a household figure instead of this distant rogue figure who lived behind the walls of Vatican City.
His outgoing personality, his training as an actor, all of that becomes a way to make people feel like the Pope means something to me.
As the Pope's message of freedom and faith permeates the West, the Soviets tighten their grip on the Eastern Bloc. John Paul II, the first Polish pope in history, acts as a beacon of hope to his ravaged homeland.
For Poland, this was a triumph of the Polish church, which had been suppressed under the Nazis and then suppressed again under the communists.
This young man who's remembering the life that he had in Poland under communism and wanting to really rid the world of what he considered to be a scourge.
In the spring of 1979, under the watchful eye of communist authorities, John Paul II makes his first visit as Pope to Poland. Millions watch the historic event on TV, including future U.S. President Ronald Reagan.
I happened to be with Ronald Reagan watching JP2 get off the airplane in Poland, descend the steps, bend over, and kiss the ground. Really, really emotional. I looked at Reagan and he had a tear in his eye. I interpreted it as having enormous historical experience.
Reagan recognizes what this Pope represents because Reagan, of course, is this anti-communist, and he recognizes this kindred soul who he believes is going to change the world.
Na ilu to miejscach Europy i świata przemawiał swoją śmiercią, że nie może być Europy sprawiedliwej bez Polski niepodległej na jej mapie.
An estimated 3 million people attend his Mass. The Pope tells his countrymen that they cannot be controlled by their government. He urges Polish Catholics to persevere with the strength that comes from faith.
The people who had gathered en masse began to sing, "We want God, we want God." What could the authorities do? The Pope's assistant whispers to him after a number of minutes, "Perhaps we should put an end to this." And the Pope said back, no, this is why I came.
He spends 9 days there, 9 very significant days. He tells people, don't listen to what the government says about you. You're Poles, you're Christians, you have a certain dignity that the state does not uphold. This lit a spark that led the Polish people to resist communism.
2/3 of the people, the population of Poland, saw him in person. This was an earth-shattering event.
The Pope's visit inspires an anti-communist uprising called Solidarity.
He supports the Solidarity movement in Poland. He's able to move forward the movement against communism in Eastern Europe.
There are strikes. The workers are demanding a union, and the Pope supports them. Unions and totalitarian systems can't coexist. The two don't go together. So the Soviet Union saw him as a real threat. They followed him. There was a lot of surveillance of his residence. They were quite worried about him.
Threats from the Soviets do not derail John Paul II's mission. He embarks upon a world tour.
He makes the world his parish.
He is someone who was seen in person by more people than anyone in the history of the earth.
Popes had traveled in the past, but never before had one pope reached so many people in so many different places.
I began flying on Pope John Paul II's jets around the world as part of the journalistic corps. He visited 129 countries. He logged over 700,000 miles. He made 14 trips to Africa. During that time, the Catholic population of Africa doubled.
Huge screens, rock and roll screens, up behind him. Today, it might seem, oh, everybody does that. Not when he started to do it. The idea of a pope in stadiums all over the world, he had a great understanding of his power.
John Paul II drives through the streets in what will come to be known as the Pope-mobile, an open vehicle allowing the Pope to truly connect with the millions who flock to see him.
It wasn't glassed in or anything like that. He would reach out to the crowds, he'd pick up babies, mingle with people in a very different way than when he's standing behind an altar. This left him open, but it also left him open in ways that may be dangerous.
As the Pope reaches more and more people, and his message of defiance becomes louder, the target on his back becomes larger. As John Paul II tours the world, spreading his message of faith and freedom, the superstar Pope amasses millions of adoring fans and one powerful enemy.
The Pope, former Cardinal Karol Wojtyła of Poland, shot today in serious condition.
In the middle of a cheering crowd in St. Peter's Square, Pope John Paul II is shot. The shooter is immediately apprehended and arrested.
The bullet misses the main artery by fractions of inches. He always credits the Blessed Mother with saving him. One hand fired, but another guided the bullet, and that other is the Blessed Mother.
The would-be assassin claims the order to kill the Pope came down from the KGB, a bombshell accusation that Italian police are never able to prove.
Whether there were orders from Moscow, nobody's ever been able to find them, but the Soviets, they understood what a threat he was. I think the most credible explanation is that the would-be assassin undertook an opportunistic moment to carry out what the Soviets wanted.
Eventually, Pope John Paul II visits his shooter in prison.
He decides to meet with the man who tries to kill him. He's offering forgiveness to this person who has done this horrible thing to him. That's a profound moment.
That's justice for an unjust act. Yet the Holy Father shows him mercy by forgiving him. And it says something about leadership. It's about sacrifice on behalf of the people you lead.
Just 22 days after eluding death, the Brazilian Pope returns to the Vatican.
His papacy is not adversely affected in any significant way by the assassination attempt. There's a short interruption, but he continues to travel.
In late 1981, the Kremlin declares martial law in Poland. Thousands of activists are jailed, and almost 100 members of the Solidarity movement are killed.
He grew up under Nazism, and then communism further represses Polish society. That's his formation. This is his culture. He wants to try to restore this fundamental principle of justice.
Pope John Paul II sees a people that are oppressed by the Soviet Union, and he sees something that is wrong, and he wants to set it right.
Breaking with hundreds of years of Vatican political neutrality, Pope John Paul II meets with President Ronald Reagan, determined to unite in a common mission.
So many people thought Ronald Reagan had to be a Catholic, but wasn't.
As you know, Your Holiness, this is my first visit to Europe as president.
Reagan had a basic desire to throw off the shackles of communism, and the Pope is an international figure who has enormous moral suasion and force. And he wanted to do something. So there was a combination of forces.
The Vatican and White House worked together to fund the Polish Solidarity movement.
John Paul II would show up in major cities where the Solidarity movement was strong, and there'd be 1 million people there listening to his every word. And every time he used the word solidarity, they knew he was speaking their language.
Solidarity movement probably would have died were it not for the involvement of Reagan and the Pope. A holy alliance between the church and the Reagan presidency to help undermine communism in Poland.
With the support of Reagan and the Pope, Solidarity membership grows to more than 10 million. In July 1983, the movement overthrows the Polish military and martial law is lifted. The Pope is praised all over the world as a brave activist, capable of catalyzing real global change.
It was a convergence of time and the commitment of will by the Holy Father. The commitment of the United States made this possible. Just an extraordinary moment.
It's because of actions he took in Poland that really sets forward a chain of events that helps lead to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union.
John Paul II fundamentally changes the role of the papacy for generations to come. He takes an institution known for its quiet piety in the face of war and tragedy and uses the platform to change history.
This doesn't mean that every one of his decisions as Pope was perfect. It doesn't mean he never made mistakes.
John Paul II made the papacy glamorous and exciting. But the danger now is that people remember the glamour and they don't recognize the really serious defects in his papacy. He did nothing about the sexual abuse by priests all over the world, not just here in the United States.
He did not seek to aggressively investigate, didn't much want to know about it, and it's a stain.
He knew how to be heroic in front of tyranny, but he could never really grasp how to deal with the modern Western world.
In a world rapidly changing its views on civil rights and sexual freedom, John Paul II's social policies remain deeply traditional.
He spoke out about human rights almost everywhere he went, but John Paul II did not hesitate to wade into controversial issues, reproductive rights, population control, and he was known as somewhat an authoritarian.
He shut down debate on major issues. He wanted everybody to believe what he believed. The great irony of John Paul II's papacy is that while he tried to boost papal authority, at his death, despite the millions at his funeral, papal authority was lower and respect for the papacy was lower than at any time in recent history. He was a rock star, but even people who respected the papacy knew they couldn't trust it anymore.
It took his successors to finally say, we must deal with this.
Despite all he accomplished, John Paul II's successors are tasked with renewing the world's faith in a broken church. At the beginning of the 20th century, popes keep quiet in the face of secular unrest. But John Paul II uses his platform to ignite real change in the name of faith and human rights.
We now today expect the Pope to be a global spokesman for people who are oppressed. We expect him to be a moral voice. That is in part the legacy of John Paul II.
Although he is responsible for making the Pope a player on the world stage, he is also responsible for many of the obstacles the modern papacy is still working to overcome.
He had a tendency to regard any other view of being a Catholic as a piece of treachery.
He came down hard on some issues that were not popular, like birth control. With Pope Benedict, we got more of the same. Benedict was a teacher and a very doctrinal pope.
Benedict was one of the cleverest popes in papal history. One of the best educated, but he was scared by the revolutionary energies which Vatican II unleashed. And he spent his days fighting against that. Benedict could not see that the tide will come in, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Pope Benedict XVI is known as a scholar. Through his prolific writings, he defends fundamental Christian values and rarely travels or makes public appearances.
John Paul II makes it very difficult for his successors. Benedict XVI was more of a theologian. This is a strenuous position for him because he's not the kind of guy who's out in front of the camera. It's difficult for him. He doesn't have that same kind of charisma.
In 2013, unable to meet the demands of the modern papacy, Benedict XVI resigns.
Benedict resigns chiefly because he could not keep up.
After Benedict's resignation, the College of Cardinals realizes that the Church needs a progressive voice. The first Jesuit Pope and the first Pope to come from the Americas is elected.
Francis is a tremendously interesting man in that he is Argentinian. There's a simplicity and a humility.
As a cardinal, as a bishop, he went into dangerous areas. He shared people's lives and homes and meals with them. Is part of a larger movement within the South American clergy to ally themselves with the poor. Unlike any other popes,
with Pope Francis comes an era of unprecedented change. He has made revolutionary statements about divorce, birth control, even offered forgiveness for women who've had abortions. He also rejects traditional church pomp and circumstance.
Right off the bat, of course, Francis rode the bus with the cardinals, refused the chauffeured car. He kept his old pair of black shoes. These are small token things, but in the popular imagination of Catholics, they count for quite a bit.
giving communion to divorced Catholics who are remarried, trying to say that homosexuals who are trying to follow Christ in their lives should not be spoken against. This is what gives him his tremendous popularity, his ability to talk to all sorts of different people and to listen.
His project is to get the church to grow up, to live with difficulty and difference, to be more open, to be more welcoming and more merciful. And he's having to use all the weight of the papacy to achieve that.
Francis continues to challenge some of the core tenets of Catholicism. As the world changes faster than ever before, how will he lead this ancient office into the future?
From one apostle to 1.2 billion followers, and now one lucky winner. Here's your chance to win a trip to the Vatican, including airfare to Rome and a private tour of the Sistine Chapel. Enter the Pope Sweepstakes at myvaticanvacation.com.
2,000 years ago, one could not have envisioned the world contemporary popes would have to navigate. And yet, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and Francis have reimagined the ancient institution in a modern world.
The papacy is a complex institution. It develops even in spite of some of the popes.
From day one, Pope Francis said the papacy has to be adapted to modern times. He has let it be known that the Church's main role is not to issue decrees, rules, and documents, but to get as close as possible to everyday people.
With 21st century technology, the papacy is able to reach more everyday people than ever before.
The Pope's on Twitter. And when we thought about a Twitter handle, one of the titles of the Pope is Pontifex, which is an old title of the Roman Emperor, which is about the bridge builder. And we thought bridge building would be a nice image because what the Pope was trying to do in social media was build bridges.
His predecessor, John Paul II, had answers before the questions had been asked. Francis is a listener.
What we're trying to build now is a structure where if somebody has a question or they have an interest, or it happens very often, the Pope tweets and there's somebody coming back saying, my child is sick, could somebody pray for my child? We're trying to get communities around the world to give a response to the people so that our communication isn't just one way, it's interactive.
A pope embracing change can move the world.
The last three men to hold the Holy Office have taken an ancient tradition and translated it for a modern era.
John Paul throws open the doors of the papacy and says we will engage at the highest level. Then you have Benedict, who is a professor, who revives the great philosophical tradition of the church. And then you have Francis, who said, and God is mercy. So in those three men, you have the mind and the soul and the heart. And the combination, I think, really present a holistic picture of what the papacy is, especially in this modern time.
The word pope comes from the Greek papas, which means father. This is something that in some eras was probably lost when popes acted like princes or kings and ruled over their subjects. But in the modern age, I think it's come back very much to the forefront. Francis kids around with people. He makes jokes. He lets them take selfies. His whole mode of being pope is fatherly.
2,000 years after God deems Peter the rock upon which he would build his church, the papacy remains a beacon of faith and unity.
Being pope today is totally different than being pope in the early days of the church. But Peter is always kept in mind by every single person who sits on Peter's throne.
The reason the papacy has been able to be so vibrant is because of the understanding there are some things that never change. The need to be that rock, that touchstone.
Francis understands what the papacy is, but at the same time, he's made it his own.
We have generations of young people who are not going to automatically join the church just because their parents did. Francis wants to bring a new energy and a whole new perspective to get people's attention.
He's been a huge encouragement to a huge number of Catholics who have felt increasingly ashamed of the institution, worried by it, and he's put a spring back in the step of a great many Catholics.
If I could answer the question of what's next, that would be a very marketable skill that I could bring anywhere in the world, and I wouldn't presume to know what's next. The thing I'm interested in is how the patterns of communication are going to change things, and I think we're only at the beginning of that.
Throughout the ages, popes have been revered and disgraced. Some have built walls, while others have torn them down. But despite war and famine, through enlightenment and innovation, the 266 men who've held the sacred office have made the